You're standing in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and the curator has just placed something in your hands. It weighs less than you expected. The clay is cool, slightly rough, the colour of dried earth after rain. This is the White Temple Foundation tablet, excavated from beneath 40 feet of compacted sand and rubble at Uruk in 1912. The inscription is barely visible now, worn by time, but the measurements it records are precise to the centimetre. 17.5 metres by 22.3 metres. 4 corners aligned exactly to true north, south, east and west. The question the curator asks is simple. How did they know? This temple was built sometime around 3200 BC, more than 5,000 years ago, by people who had no magnetic compasses, no GPS, no surveying equipment as we understand it. Yet the alignment is perfect, not approximate, not close enough for religious symbolism. Perfect. The kind of precision that suggests the orientation mattered for reasons beyond ceremony. The kind of precision that implies function. Take a moment, if you would, to tell us in the comments where you're listening from, what city, what time of night, because what we're about to explore exists in your world too, not in museums or excavation sites, but in the questions we inherit from people who built things they claimed were instructed by beings called the Anunnaki. Gods who came from the sky. Gods who, according to thousands of clay tablets, assigned specific tasks to specific groups. 300 in heaven, 300 on earth. Numbers presented not as poetry, but as organisation. The texts don't call these structures temples in the way we might imagine temples, houses of worship where believers gathered. The Sumerian word is different. House. But not a house for living, a house for something else. And when you track these houses across millennia, across dynasties that rose and fell and rose again, you find something unusual. The locations don't change. Empires collapse, cities burn, populations scatter, yet within a generation, someone returns to the exact same spot and rebuilds. Not nearby, not in the general vicinity, exactly there, on foundations that go down through 18 layers of previous buildings, each constructed atop the ruins of the last. This is not how humans typically build. We adapt to circumstances. We move where resources exist, where defence is possible, where trade routes intersect. But these sites show something different. They show return, persistent, deliberate, expensive return to specific geographic coordinates, generation after generation, for 3,000 years. The mainstream interpretation is straightforward. These were sacred locations, made holy by tradition, and tradition compelled rebuilding. But that explanation assumes the sanctity came first, and the building followed. What if it was the other way around? What if these locations were selected for properties that made them useful, and sanctity was the language available to describe that usefulness? What if these structures, these houses, were not built to worship gods, but to enable gods to what? The tablet suggests this, not in metaphor, in procedure. The Gudea cylinders housed in the Louvre describe a ruler who receives detailed architectural specifications in dreams. The god Ningirsu appears and provides measurements, materials, orientations. Gudea follows the instructions precisely. He doesn't interpret, he doesn't improvise. He builds what he's told to build, where he's told to build it, because the text says this allows Ningirsu to descend, to inhabit, to see. For over a century, archaeologists have excavated these sites, published the findings, catalogued the artefacts. The information exists in university collections, in museum databases, in excavation reports bound in leather and stored in archives that smell of old paper and dust. What has been missing is not evidence, but a question. Not what did these people believe, but what did these structures do? Because belief is internal, subjective, impossible to verify from fragments of clay. But function can be tested. alignments can be measured, sight lines can be calculated, and when you calculate them, when you map the orientations of ziggurats across Mesopotamia, when you track which stars rise over which temples at which times of year, you find patterns, intentional, repeated, maintained patterns that suggest these buildings were designed to interact with the sky in specific ways, to track, to record, to observe. This investigation begins with architecture and follows it where it leads. Through 18 layers of temples at Eridu, through astronomical tablets that record planetary positions for 600 years, through king lists that describe rulers reigning before a flood that geology confirms happened, through foundation deposits that mark locations with inscribed pegs driven into bedrock as if claiming coordinates, through texts that describe divine powers as physical objects that can be stolen, carried, installed. The Anunnaki, according to these texts, were not abstract spiritual forces. They had tasks, they had jurisdictions, they came to Earth, they worked, they assigned work to others, and they established structures to administer that work. The tablets present this not as mythology, but as record, as history, as memory of how things were organized when these beings were present. What we're asking is uncomfortable. What if they never left? What if they simply relocated, not to the stars or to another dimension, but to places less visible, less accessible? What if the structures they commissioned, the temples built to specifications they provided, remain functional, still aligned, still oriented, still positioned over aquifers and fault lines and locations, the texts called bonds between heaven and earth? What if you can observe without being seen? That is the question this exploration holds. Not whether the Anunnaki are observing, but what observing would look like if they were, and whether the archaeological record contains exactly what we would expect to find if these structures served purposes we have not yet considered. The evidence doesn't prove anything. Evidence never does. But it suggests, it implies. It asks us to look again at buildings we thought we understood, at alignments we assumed were symbolic, at texts we interpreted as myths. The White Temple tablet is back in its vault now, stored in darkness, its inscription slowly eroding. But the temple it describes is still there, beneath the sand of southern Iraq, still oriented to the cardinal points, still waiting to be understood not as a ruin of belief, but as the remnant of infrastructure, silent, precise, aligned. 18 temples built upon temples. The excavation at Eridu began in the winter of 1946, 3 years after the work had been interrupted by war. The team from Iraq's State Organization of Antiquities and Heritage arrived at a site that had been undisturbed for millennia except by wind and the slow collapse of mud brick returning to earth. What they found beneath the sand would rewrite understanding of how old Mesopotamian civilization actually was. More importantly, it would raise questions about why anyone would build in the same location, on the same foundations, for over 2,000 years. 18 distinct building levels, 18 separate temples, each constructed directly atop the ruins of its predecessor. The earliest, at the bottom of the stratigraphic sequence, dated to approximately 5400 BCE. The latest, at the top, to around 2000 BCE. 34 centuries of continuous rebuilding in exactly the same spot. The site was called Eridu in Sumerian texts, the first city according to their records, the place where kingship lowered from heaven after the flood, the location of the Iabzu, the house of Enki, god of the underground waters and secret knowledge. But those are the mythological designations, the religious explanations. The archaeological facts are stranger and more specific. Each of the 18 temples follows the same orientation. The entrance faces northeast. The central chamber aligns along a northwest-southeast axis. Small offerings rooms branch from the main hall. The progression through the levels shows gradual increase in size and architectural sophistication, but the fundamental design remains constant. Generation after generation, the builders cleared rubble, levelled foundations, and reconstructed the same temple in the same orientation, in the same place. Mainstream interpretation frames this as religious conservatism. Sacred architecture, once established, must be maintained. Temples are rebuilt where temples stood because tradition demands continuity. That explanation assumes the sacredness preceded the construction, that myth determined location, but the archaeological evidence suggests something different. Location determined myth. Something about this specific spot required preservation, something that predated the first temple and persisted through the construction of the 18th. Consider the geography. Eridu sits at what was once the northern shore of the Persian Gulf, though the coastline has migrated south over millennia due to sediment deposit from the Tigris and Euphrates. In ancient times, this was the edge where fresh water from the rivers met salt water from the Gulf, creating marshlands rich with fish and waterfowl. The water table was high. Wells reached fresh water at shallow depth. Springs bubbled up through limestone fissures, creating what the Sumerians called the Abzu, the primeval ocean beneath the earth, source of all fresh water, domain of Enki. The texts are specific about this. Enki dwells in the Abzu. His temple, the E-Abzu, is built over it. The underground waters are his domain, his power, his responsibility. From the depths, he dispenses wisdom, secret knowledge, and the me, those mysterious divine powers that enable civilization. The language is consistent across hundreds of tablets. Enki is down there, beneath the surface, beneath the temple, in the waters that feed the world above. One reading treats this as cosmology, metaphor, the underworld as spiritual concept, but another reading takes the text literally. What if the E-Abzu was built over a specific aquifer or underground water system because access to that system mattered? What if the temple's persistence across 34 centuries indicates not religious devotion, but functional necessity? What if something about the hydrology of this location made it irreplaceable? Groundwater aquifers can serve as natural reservoirs, maintaining constant temperature and humidity. Underground water systems create acoustic properties, sound carries differently, resonates differently. Some aquifers possess unusual mineral content that affects conductivity. In modern technology, we use water for cooling, for power generation, for data transmission through fibre optic cables submerged in oceans. The idea that underground water systems could serve functional purposes beyond drinking and irrigation is not speculative, it's engineering. The question becomes, did the Sumerians understand this? And if so, how? The earliest levels at Eridu, dating to 5400 BCE, show sophisticated construction. The builders used plano-convex bricks, curved on one side, flat on the other, laid in herringbone patterns that improved structural integrity. They incorporated drainage systems. They understood load-bearing architecture. This was not experimental construction. This was application of existing knowledge, which implies the knowledge came from somewhere, either from accumulated experience predating the first temple or from instruction. The Gudea cylinders, which we'll examine more closely later, describe exactly such instruction. A god appears in dreams and provides specifications, not vague spiritual guidance, but measurements and materials and methods. The ruler builds according to those specifications because the structure must function correctly for the god to inhabit it. The text presents this transaction as straightforward, proper construction enables divine presence. Improper construction prevents it. If we remove the theological language and focus on function, the pattern suggests something like remote monitoring. A structure must meet certain specifications orientation, dimensions, materials, location to fulfill its purpose. Those specifications persist across cultures and dynasties because the purpose persists. The language changes. The religious interpretations shift from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Persian. But the rebuilding continues. Same location, same alignment, same architecture. The excavation reports from Eridu note something else unusual. Between some of the temple levels, there are thin layers of ash and destruction debris, evidence of fire, collapse, abandonment. Yet the rebuilding follows swiftly, archaeologically speaking, within what appears to be a single generation. Someone returned. Someone who knew exactly where the previous temple had stood, exactly how it had been oriented, exactly what design it had followed. The institutional memory required for this continuity is extraordinary. It suggests record-keeping, documentation, plans maintained across periods of catastrophe. The Sumerians kept such records. Their cuneiform tablets catalogue everything from grain storage to astronomical observations to building specifications. The practice of documentation was central to their culture. They wrote things down because writing made knowledge permanent. It survived floods and fires and the death of individuals. It could be copied, archived, transported. The tablets themselves were sometimes baked deliberately to ensure their preservation, transforming clay into stone. Among those tablets are references to the bond of heaven and earth. Multiple cities claim this designation: Nippur, Babylon, Eridu. The term appears to denote something more than symbolic importance. These were locations where, according to the texts, heaven and earth connected, where gods descended, where communication between realms occurred. The language is consistent enough across sources that it seems to describe a category, a classification of certain sites as having properties others lacked. Modern archaeology interprets these designations as political or religious claims. Cities competed for prestige, for pilgrimage traffic, for donations. Claiming divine favour was practical strategy. But that interpretation doesn't explain why Nippur, which we'll explore in a later chapter, remained sacred even when it held no political power. Conquerors who destroyed rival cities and deported populations left Nippur intact. Kings who worshipped different gods still made offerings there. For 3,000 years, Nippur maintained its status despite having nothing to offer but location. That suggests the importance was geographic, not cultural. Something about where Nippur stood, about where Eridu stood, about where these designated sites existed in relationship to each other and to features we may not have identified yet. The Sumerians mapped their cities carefully. They recorded distances. They noted orientations. The tablet maps that survive show understanding of spatial relationships, of how locations connect across terrain. If these sites formed a network, what would that network do? The question hangs over Eridu's 18 levels like the silence that fills archaeological sites after excavation teams depart. The temples have been measured, photographed, catalogued. The pottery has been analysed. The stratification documented. The reports sit in archives. But the fundamental question, why this spot, why this persistence, why this precision, remains answered only with hypothesis about religious tradition, as if tradition alone could compel 34 centuries of reconstruction without deviation, without drift, without any of the variation human culture typically introduces across time. There is another explanation, one the texts themselves provide, if we read them not as mythology but as description. These sites were selected. The selection criteria was specific. The structures built on them required maintenance because their function required maintenance. They were not monuments to belief, they were installations, infrastructure, and the beings who commissioned them provided specifications that ensured the infrastructure would persist even after their direct presence became less visible. The Anunnaki, according to Sumerian sources, were assigned to Earth. 300 of them. They worked here. They built here. They established cities and systems and structures. Then something changed. The texts describe a reorganization, a division of labour, a reassignment of some Anunnaki to other realms. But infrastructure doesn't relocate. It remains, performing its function, requiring maintenance. And at Eridu, for over 3,000 years, that maintenance was provided. Temple after temple after temple, 18 times, in exactly the same place. The Iabzu still rests beneath the sand. The excavations exposed its foundations, photographed its walls, removed many artefacts to museums, but the location itself remains. The aquifer beneath it remains. The alignment it was built to maintain remains. Whether anything still uses that alignment, still monitors through that position, still observes through architecture designed for observation, that remains unknown. We no longer maintain it. We study it as history. But history, at sites like Eridu, has a way of feeling less past than paused when gods gave building instructions. The cylinder is almost 3 feet tall, covered entirely in cuneiform script, nearly 1,400 lines of text, inscribed with obsessive precision into clay before firing. This is Gudea Cylinder A, catalogue number AO 3293 in the Louvre's collection, discovered at Tello in southern Iraq in the 1870s. Its companion, Cylinder B, catalogue AO 3294, contains another 1,200 lines. Together, they form one of the longest and most complete literary works, surviving from 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, dated to approximately 2125 BCE. The text describes in exhaustive detail the construction of a temple, not the symbolism of construction, not the spiritual significance, the actual process, materials, measurements, workers, timeline. But the remarkable element, the detail that makes Gudea's account different from other building inscriptions, appears at the beginning. Before construction begins, Gudea has a dream. In that dream, a figure appears. The text identifies this figure as Ningirsu, the city god of Lagash, patron deity of Gudea's kingdom. Ningirsu has a message, his temple requires rebuilding, and he provides the specifications. The dream sequence consumes several columns of text. Gudea sees a man whose stature reaches from earth to sky, whose head wears the crown of divinity, whose appearance radiates light. This figure is flanked by others, the goddess Nisaba, with a tablet of favourable stars ready to record the specifications, a warrior with a tablet of lapis lazuli drawing the plan of the temple. The details are specific, visual, concrete. These are not symbolic visions. Gudea describes them as if reporting events, but he doesn't fully understand what he's seen. The dream is vivid, but parts of it are unclear. So he does what the text describes as proper procedure. He consults Nene, goddess of dream interpretation, at her temple in another city. He travels to her shrine, makes offerings, sleeps in the sacred precinct to receive clarification, and Nene interprets. She confirms that Ningirsu wants his temple rebuilt. She specifies that Gudea must not deviate from the divine plan. The work must be done exactly as instructed. Gudea obeys. The cylinders then chronicle, month by month, the construction process. Cedar imported from Lebanon, gold from Malua, copper from the Zagros Mountains, diorite from Magan. The procurement of materials reads like a logistics report: quantities, sources, transport methods, workers mobilized from throughout the kingdom, organized into crews assigned to specific tasks. The foundation is laid on an auspicious day determined by astronomical observation. The walls rise according to specified dimensions. Every stage of construction follows procedure. This is where mainstream interpretation and the text itself diverge. Scholars read Gudea's account as religious propaganda. Rulers in ancient Mesopotamia routinely claimed divine approval for their projects. Attributing architectural plans to gods legitimized expense, justified taxation, sanctified the ruler's role. The dream narrative by this reading is political theatre. Gudea needed to rebuild the temple. Perhaps the old structure had deteriorated. Perhaps political considerations demanded a show of piety, so he framed the project as divine command. That interpretation is reasonable given what we know about ancient politics, but it doesn't explain the precision. Gudea's description of the temple includes measurements down to fractions of cubits, orientations specified to particular stars, materials selected for specific structural properties. If this was propaganda, it's remarkably technical propaganda, and the result, the Anunu temple Gudea built, stood for centuries, became one of the most important religious sites in Mesopotamia, and established architectural standards that influenced construction throughout the region. Something about Gudea's temple worked, not just symbolically, but functionally. The building performed as intended. It became a centre of administration, scholarship, and astronomical observation. Thousands of tablets were produced there, recording everything from economic transactions to mathematical tables to star catalogues. The temple functioned as what we might recognise as an institutional hub, a place where information was collected, processed, stored and distributed. The text suggests this was intentional. Ningisu doesn't just want a temple, he wants a temple that enables specific activities. The word used is Giguna, which translates roughly as chamber of night, associated with rituals performed in darkness, with astronomical observations, with activities requiring precisely oriented sightlines. The temple includes raised platforms, chambers with carefully positioned windows, and a ziggurat, a stage tower attached to the main structure. From the top of that ziggurat, the horizon is visible in all directions. The night sky is unobstructed. Modern archaeoastronomy has examined Mesopotamian temple orientations systematically. The findings are striking. Most major temples align to solstices, equinoxes, or the rising points of specific stars. These alignments are not approximate. They are precise enough to have required careful measurement and calculation. The builders understood how to determine true north, how to calculate angular relationships between celestial objects, how to design structures that would maintain those alignments despite the gradual precession of Earth's axis. How did they know? That question applies not just to Gudea, but to cultures throughout ancient Mesopotamia. The knowledge appears early, fully formed, without the slow developmental progression we expect from trial and error. The earliest temples show the same sophistication as later ones. The astronomical understanding evident in sites from 3500 BC matches what we find in sites from 2000 BCE. The technology is stable, consistent, successful. Either multiple generations of builders independently rediscovered the same solutions, or the solutions were taught, transmitted, preserved across time by institutional continuity. The cuneiform record supports the second option. Training texts survive. Mathematical problems demonstrating how to calculate areas, volumes, angles, astronomical tablets recording systematic observations across decades. What we would recognise as scientific methodology: observe, record, compare, refine. The temples functioned as centres of this work. Scribes were educated there. Specialists in divination, astronomy and mathematics were attached to temple staffs. The institutions accumulated knowledge. But where did the initial framework come from? Gudea's account offers one answer: it was given, provided in dreams, through visions, by beings the texts identify as gods, but describe with specificity unusual for divine figures in mythology. Ningisu has measurements, he has materials requirements, he has quality standards. The text specifies that certain structural elements must be made from specific materials, not because of their symbolic value, but because of their properties. Columns of cedar, because cedar resists rot and insect damage. Foundations of diorite, because diorite is dense and stable. Door sockets of bronze, because bronze withstands wear. These are engineering considerations presented as divine instruction. If we reframe the language, if instead of God we read technical authority or project administrator, the account becomes more coherent. Someone with knowledge of construction, materials science, and astronomical alignment provided specifications to Gudea. Gudea, who possessed political authority and resource access, but perhaps not complete technical knowledge, followed those specifications. The result was a structure that functioned as designed. The cylinder never explicitly states where Ningirsu came from or where he returned to after providing instructions. He appears, he instructs, he departs. The text treats this as normal procedure. Gods descend when needed for specific purposes, then return to wherever they reside when not actively engaged with humans. The cosmology allows for this mobility. Heaven, earth, and the netherworld are presented not as metaphysical states, but as locations. Beings move between them. The Anunnaki are explicitly described as assigned to different realms, some in heaven, some on earth, some in the underworld. Movement between assignments is possible. This functional description of divine hierarchy sounds less like religion and more like organizational structure. Authority is distributed, responsibilities are assigned, certain figures oversee certain domains, communication occurs through designated channels, dreams, omens, appearances at temples. The system has procedures. It operates according to protocols that humans are expected to follow if they want their interactions with the system to succeed. Gudea followed protocol. He received instructions. He consulted the dream interpreter to ensure accurate understanding. He procured materials exactly as specified. He oriented the building precisely. He completed the work according to timeline. And the result was considered so successful that he had his achievement inscribed on cylinders designed to endure. Not on perishable papyrus, not on wood or cloth, but on fired clay. Permanent record. Documentation that the work was done correctly, that the specifications were met, that the structure was completed according to divine or technical standards. Those cylinders have survived over 4,000 years. They rest now in climate-controlled cases in Paris, far from the desert where Gudea ruled a small Sumerian city-state. The temple he built is gone, reduced to foundations and scattered bricks. But the record remains. The account of how a ruler received building instructions, followed them precisely, and created something that served purposes we may not fully understand. Because the text never actually explains what the temple was for. It describes construction, it describes materials and dimensions and orientations. But the ultimate purpose, what happened in that Gigonnar, that chamber of night, what observations were made from that ziggurat, what information was collected there, the cylinders leave unstated. Perhaps that knowledge was separate from Gudea. Perhaps his role was simply to build. Others would use what he built. Others would perform whatever functions the structure enabled. The instructions came from somewhere. The building followed specifications provided by someone with precise knowledge. The structure stood for centuries, and the pattern repeated across Mesopotamia. Rulers received divine instructions, built accordingly, and created temples that served as centres of observation, administration, and knowledge preservation. What we call mythology may simply be the available vocabulary for describing technical assistance from sources the recipients could not fully explain. The gods descended. They provided knowledge. They returned to wherever they came from, and the structures they commissioned remained precisely aligned, carefully oriented, positioned for purposes that archaeology is only beginning to investigate systematically. The cylinders of Gudea are not legends, they're reports, filed with obsessive bureaucratic detail, preserved intentionally, meant to endure. Whoever reads them 4,000 years ago or today encounters the same information. This is what was built, this is how it was built, this is who instructed the building. The questions the cylinders raise have not changed. only our willingness to ask them. The geometry of divine sight. The Ziggurat-Ur rises from the desert in stages, each level smaller than the one below, creating the stepped pyramid profile that defines Mesopotamian sacred architecture. What remains today is only the base, 3 massive platforms of mud brick, reconstructed in the 1980s based on the original foundations excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. But even this fragment demonstrates something remarkable. From the uppermost surviving platform, roughly 60 feet above the surrounding plain, the horizon stretches unobstructed in all directions. Nothing blocks the view. Nothing interrupts sight lines to the sky. This is not accidental. Recent studies in archaeoastronomy have systematically analysed ziggurat orientations across Mesopotamia. The data set includes structures from Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Babylon, Borsippa, Chogha-Zambil, and several smaller sites. The sample spans nearly 2,000 years of construction, from approximately 3000 BCE to 550 BCE. Despite differences in period, culture, and local religious tradition, the structures show consistent patterns. Approximately 80% of ziggurats examined align their corners to the cardinal directions, true north, south, east, west, with precision ranging from less than 1 degree to 3 degrees of deviation. The White Temple at Uruk, which we encountered in the opening, achieves accuracy within half a degree. The ziggurat of Ur shows deviation of approximately 1 degree. These are not rough approximations. They represent deliberate, measured alignment requiring calculation and verification. How does one determine true north without magnetic compasses? Several methods were available to ancient astronomers. The simplest involves observing the night sky. At northern latitudes, the celestial North Pole can be located by tracking star rotation. Stars appear to circle a fixed point in the sky as Earth rotates. If you mark the position of a star at several points throughout the night and calculate the centre of its apparent circular path, you've found true north. This method requires clear skies, patience, and record keeping, but it's accessible to any culture that conducts systematic astronomical observation. The Mesopotamians conducted such observation. The tablets prove it. The Mul.Apian star catalogue, compiled around 1000 BC, but recording knowledge that predates the tablets by centuries, lists stars by their rising and setting positions relative to the horizon. It divides the sky into paths, 3 zones corresponding to the gods Enlil, Anu, and Ea, and tracks which stars rise at which times of year. This is systematic, long-term observation, the kind that accumulates accurate data about celestial mechanics. But ziggurat alignments show something more sophisticated than simple north finding. Many structures align not just to cardinal points, but to specific astronomical phenomena, solstice sunrises, equinox sunsets, the rising points of prominent stars. The temple complex at Uruk, for instance, includes sight lines that align with the summer solstice sunrise. The ziggurat at Chogha-Zambil in Iran shows orientation that tracks the winter solstice sunset. These alignments require understanding not just of where stars are now, but of how their positions change across the year and over longer periods across centuries. Earth's axis precesses slowly, completing a full cycle approximately every 26,000 years. This precession changes which star appears closest to the celestial North Pole and shifts the rising points of all stars gradually over time. The phenomenon is subtle but measurable across a human lifetime with careful records. Across generations, the shift becomes obvious. Any culture maintaining continuous astronomical observation over centuries would notice precession and potentially account for it in their calculations. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, systematic records of nightly sky observations maintained for approximately 600 years from the 8th century BC to the 2nd century BC, demonstrate exactly this level of continuity. These were institutional records kept by scribes trained in astronomical observation, maintained across political changes and cultural shifts. The practice of observation transcended individual practitioners. It was embedded in institutions centered at temples, which returns us to the ziggurats themselves. These structures were not merely platforms for ritual, they were observation stations, elevated, oriented, positioned to provide clear sight lines to horizons and sky. The upper terraces, the ones that have not survived at most sites, would have been higher still, 60 to 90 feet above ground level in the largest examples. From those heights, the curvature of Earth becomes just barely perceptible. The horizon expands, atmospheric distortion decreases, conditions for astronomical observation improve measurably. Modern observatories are built on mountains for similar reasons. Elevation reduces atmospheric interference. Remote locations minimize light pollution. Stable platforms enable precise instrument positioning. Ancient observers lacked telescopes, but understood the value of height and unobstructed views. They built ziggurats in flat plains, where natural high ground didn't exist. They created artificial mountains positioned and oriented for maximum observational capability. But observation of what? The tablets specify stars, planets, the moon, the sun, the mole. Appin catalogue names 33 stars in the path of Enlil, 23 in the path of Anu, 15 in the path of E. These are reference stars used to track time, mark seasons, and coordinate calendars. But the catalogue also includes information stranger than simple star positions. It records heliacal risings, the date when a star first becomes visible just before sunrise, after a period of being too close to the sun to see. These dates shift with precession. Recording them requires multi-generational observation programs and understanding that celestial mechanics change over long time scales. Why maintain such records? The practical answer: agriculture and administration required accurate calendars. Knowing when seasons change, when floods come, when to plant and harvest, this information had economic value. Astronomical observation provided the data needed to create reliable calendars. Temples, as centres of administrative authority, naturally became centres of astronomical work. But that explanation doesn't account for the precision, the continuity, or the investment of resources. Calendars need only be accurate enough for agricultural timing. You don't need to track precession to know when spring arrives. You don't need perfectly cardinal aligned ziggurats to observe seasonal changes. Basic astronomy suffices for practical calendars. The Mesopotamians went far beyond basic. Their mathematics supports this. Cuneiform mathematical tablets demonstrate understanding of sexagesimal calculation, which is ideal for astronomical computation because 60 divides evenly by many factors. They understood geometry well enough to calculate areas of complex shapes, volumes of irregular solids, and angular relationships. They could predict lunar eclipses with surprising accuracy. These are not skills that develop for agricultural calendars alone. They're skills that develop from long-term, systematic study pursued for its own sake, or for purposes the tablets don't explicitly state. The tablets describe the Anunnaki as watchers. The term appears frequently. They watch over humanity, they observe, they monitor. The language is consistent across sources. But what does observation require? Unobstructed sightlines, elevated positions, stable platforms, reference points for triangulation, a network of observation stations positioned to provide coverage across a region, standardized methods for recording observations so data from different locations can be compared, institutional continuity to maintain equipment, train observers, and preserve records across generations. Mesopotamian temples provided all of this. The ziggurats were the elevated platforms. The astronomical tablets were the standardized records. The priestly scribal schools were the training system. The temples themselves rebuilt continuously on the same locations for millennia, were the institutional framework. And the network existed: Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Babylon, and dozens of smaller sites, all aligned to cardinal directions, all maintaining astronomical observation programs, all connected by trade routes and communication systems that allowed information exchange. If you wanted to monitor a region across centuries, this is the infrastructure you would build. Permanent observation stations positioned for optimal coverage, oriented for precise measurements, staffed by trained specialists whose positions were hereditary, ensuring knowledge transmission across generations. The religious framework provides motivation and funding. The administrative structure provides organization. The result is a network that persists regardless of political changes, because its value transcends any individual kingdom. No single ruler built this network. It accumulated over time, each generation adding sites, refining alignments, improving methods, but the patterns suggest coordination, not centralized control, but shared standards, shared understanding of what alignments mattered, what observations to record, what measurements to maintain. That shared framework implies either common cultural origins or common instruction. The text suggests the latter. Gods provided specifications. They taught astronomy, mathematics, architecture. They established the temples and designated which gods would reside at which locations. Enki at Eridu, Enlil at Nippur, Anu at Uruk, Marduk at Babylon. The distribution of divine authority across sites matches the distribution of specialized functions. Different temples focused on different aspects of knowledge, but all participated in the same overall system, and they watched. The texts emphasize this. The gods see everything. They know everything. They observe from their temples. The language is not metaphorical judgment from distant heaven. It's administrative oversight from nearby towers. The ziggurats provide the height. The alignments provide the precision. The institutional framework provides the continuity. And the observation itself, systematic, ongoing, recorded, continues for thousands of years, until it doesn't. The observational programs eventually ceased. The ziggurat construction stopped. The astronomical diaries ended in the 2nd century BC after 600 years of continuous record. Why? One possibility: the observers left, or withdrew, or no longer required direct human assistance in observation. The infrastructure remained. Much of it still stands, but active maintenance ceased. The temples became ruins. The sight lines persisted, but no one staffed them. The alignments remained perfect, but no one calibrated instruments to them. Or perhaps observation continues through means we don't recognize as observation. The structures remain oriented, remain positioned, remain connected to celestial mechanics through alignments that don't degrade. Modern technology might observe through satellites and sensors. Ancient technology, if we can call it that, might observe through precisely aligned stone and carefully positioned foundations built over aquifers and fault lines and geographic coordinates selected for properties we haven't fully identified. The geometry enables it. The sight lines persist. The cardinal alignments hold. The ziggurat at Ur still faces true north. The White Temple at Uruk still orients its corners to the compass points. The foundations at Eridu still rest over the Abzu, over the underground waters, over whatever properties made that location irreplaceable. From those heights, someone once watched. Whether anyone watches still is not a question archaeology can answer, but the capability remains. The geometry still functions. The divine sight lines, if we understand that term as technical rather than theological, still align. Foundations buried with intention. In 1923, during excavations at the Kassite Temple in Ur, archaeologists discovered something unusual beneath a wall foundation, a ceramic box buried 4 feet below ground level. Inside the box, 4 clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform, 16 copper figures of gods, fragments of gold and lapis lazuli, and a collection of stone chips representing various minerals. The tablets identified the builder, King Bernaburiash II of the Kassite dynasty, approximately 1359-1333 BC, and described the temple being constructed. But they were never intended to be read by contemporary eyes. They were foundation deposits, buried deliberately during construction, meant to remain hidden within the structure. This practice was standard throughout Mesopotamian civilization. Nearly every major temple, palace and fortification excavated in the region contains foundation deposits. The contents vary by period and location, but the pattern is consistent. Valuable objects inscribed with information about the building are placed in the foundations during construction, often in carefully prepared boxes or vessels positioned at specific structural points, usually corners or beneath doorways. The mainstream interpretation treats foundation deposits as ritual offerings. They sanctify the building, invoke divine protection, commemorate the ruler's piety. The inscriptions serve as eternal testimony before the gods, ensuring the builder's name and achievements are remembered even if the structure itself is destroyed. This interpretation is reasonable given what we know about ancient religious practice. Similar foundation rituals appear in many cultures, often including sacrifices, offerings, or inscribed objects. But the Mesopotamian deposits have characteristics that suggest function beyond symbolism. They're positioned with precision. They include specific materials, metals, stones, ceramics, selected for properties that the inscriptions occasionally reference. They mark locations. And in some cases, they're not just buried once, but renewed. Subsequent rulers who rebuilt temples on the same foundations excavated the previous deposits, read them, and either reburied them or placed new deposits alongside the old ones. This represents something more than ritual. It's documentation, record keeping, permanent markers that identify what was built, when it was built, who authorized construction, and sometimes, if you read closely, why the location mattered. Consider a foundation tablet from Nippur dating to approximately 2095 BCE, discovered during University of Pennsylvania excavations in the 1890s. The inscription begins conventionally. It names the king Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur. It describes his piety, his devotion to Enlil, god of Nippur. Then it provides measurements, dimensions of the temple platform, depth of the foundation trenches, volume of earth excavated, weight of materials used. These are engineering specifications recorded in permanent form and buried where they would remain undisturbed unless the structure was dismantled. Why record this information? For rebuilding. Across Mesopotamian history, temples were regularly reconstructed. Mud brick deteriorates. Flood damage occurs. Political changes or religious reforms require modifications. When reconstruction happened, the builders excavated foundations to assess the previous structure. The foundation deposits provided information about original design, dimensions, and construction methods. They were reference documents, archived in the most permanent location possible, the structure itself. But the deposits contain more than documentation. Many included chips or fragments of various stones, carnelian, lapis lazuli, hematite, limestone, diorite. These weren't decorative, they were samples. The inscriptions sometimes specify that materials used in construction came from particular sources: copper from the northern mountains, gold from Maluha, cedar from Lebanon. The stone chips verified this. They proved that specified materials were actually used, that construction standards were met, that the structure contained what its builders claimed. This level of material verification suggests quality control. Someone, whether human administrators or divine overseers, wanted permanent proof that construction followed specifications. The deposits served as audit records, buried where they couldn't be altered or removed without physically dismantling the building. Some foundation deposits included copper figurines depicting gods or protective spirits. These figures weren't random devotional objects. Their positions were specified. Corner foundations often received 4 figures, one oriented toward each cardinal direction. Doorway foundations received figures facing inward. The positioning suggests a different purpose than offering, marking. These figures designated key structural points. In modern construction, we mark such points with surveying stakes or reference pins. The Mesopotamians used inscribed metal objects, positioned precisely and buried permanently. The figures themselves sometimes bore inscriptions identifying which god or spirit they represented and what protection they provided. But the inscriptions also noted their position, placed at the northeast corner of the foundation or positioned beneath the doorway of the inner chamber. These are surveying notes, permanent markers noting key coordinates within the structure. Why make such markers permanent? One possibility relates to reconstruction accuracy. If a temple required rebuilding, the foundation deposits ensured the new structure could be positioned exactly where the old one stood. This matters if location is critical, if specific coordinates must be maintained, if alignment to other structures is necessary, if the building must be positioned over subsurface features like aquifers or bedrock formations. Another possibility, the markers served ongoing function. Certain foundation deposits included bronze pegs driven deep into the ground beneath foundation walls. These pegs extended below the building's footprint into bedrock or water table. Some were inscribed, some plain. Their purpose was described variously as fixing the building to the earth or establishing connection to the deep. Modern lightning rods serve a similar function, metal conductors driven into ground, establishing electrical connection to earth. Grounding systems for electrical installations require deep metal stakes to dissipate charge safely. The Mesopotamian foundation pegs share structural similarity, metal, driven deep, connected to the building structure above. If we remove the religious language describing their purpose and focus on what they physically do, they ground the building. They establish electrical connection between structure and earth. Did the Mesopotamians understand electrical grounding? Not in modern terms. But they understood that storms brought lightning, that lightning struck tall structures preferentially, that metal attracted lightning. The ziggurats were the tallest structures for miles. They were struck regularly. Some structural evidence suggests lightning damage, vitrified brick, fused materials, scorch marks. Whether the foundation pegs provided protection or served other purposes related to atmospheric electricity is speculative, but the structures were positioned to attract lightning, and the builders took measures that would incidentally create grounding systems. There's another property of metal stakes driven into earth. They interact with groundwater and aquifers. Electrolysis occurs. Mineral deposits form. Conductive pathways develop. In modern times, we use grounding systems not just for lightning protection, but for telecommunications, for reducing electromagnetic interference, for establishing reference points for sensitive instruments. The Mesopotamian foundation deposits created similar systems, whether or not that was their intended purpose. The texts sometimes describe these buried objects as enabling communication. So that the god may hear is a phrase appearing in several foundation inscriptions. The deposits allow the deity to inhabit the temple, to descend into it, to establish his dwelling. If we read these phrases functionally rather than theologically, they suggest the deposits created conditions necessary for whatever process the temple facilitated. Without proper foundation deposits, without the metal, the inscriptions, the positioned markers, the building didn't function correctly. This interpretation finds support in accounts of improper construction. Texts exist describing temples that failed, that didn't attract divine favour, that had to be rebuilt because something was wrong. Often the correction involved redoing foundations, replacing deposits, repositioning elements. The language implies troubleshooting. The first attempt didn't work, so specifications were rechecked and problems corrected. Temples were technology, complex, precisely specified technology whose function we may not fully understand. The foundation deposits were components of that technology, marking positions, establishing electrical connections, documenting specifications, verifying materials. They were buried intentionally because they had to remain in place permanently, undisturbed, maintaining whatever properties the structure required. Modern buildings have foundation documents too, blueprints, specifications, materials lists, but we store them in archives, in digital databases. The Mesopotamians had no such storage systems. Their archives were clay tablets that could burn, buildings that could collapse. So they buried copies in the foundations. Permanent storage. Preserved by the earth itself, those deposits remain. Most major museums with Mesopotamian collections possess foundation deposits recovered during excavations. The tablets can be read, the metal objects analysed, the stone chips identified. Everything is documented, catalogued, published in excavation reports. What hasn't been fully explored is why such elaborate care went into marking and documenting foundations for buildings the mainstream interpretation treats as ceremonial. Perhaps because the buildings weren't merely ceremonial. Perhaps the foundations mattered for reasons beyond structural stability. Perhaps the deposits marked something, or connected something, or enabled something. The texts say they allowed gods to descend, to inhabit, to observe. We can dismiss that as superstition, or we can ask what it would mean for architecture to enable observation. What properties would such architecture require? What would its foundations need to do? The deposits suggest answers. Position must be exact. Materials must be specified. Connections to groundwater or bedrock must be established. Documentation must be permanent. The structure must be maintainable across centuries, rebuildable to exact specifications if destroyed. All of this was provided, deliberately, with care that suggests importance beyond devotion. The foundations are still there, beneath sand and rubble, beneath reconstructions and ruins. The deposits remain buried, marking coordinates, maintaining connections, preserving information. Whether anything still reads that information, whether the systems those foundations enabled still function, whether observation continues through infrastructure built 5,000 years ago, these questions remain open. But the capability was built in, intentionally. The foundations were laid for it. The Abzu beneath. The concept appears across hundreds of Sumerian texts, consistent in detail. The Abzu is the deep underground freshwater ocean from which all springs, rivers and wells ultimately derive. It is not metaphorical underworld or spiritual realm. The texts describe it as physical location. Water, vast quantities of water beneath the earth. The domain of Enki, who dwells there in his temple, the Abzu, built over the waters at Eridu. Modern hydrology confirms the Abzu's existence, though not quite as ancient Sumerians described it. The region of southern Mesopotamia sits atop extensive aquifer systems. Groundwater permeates the limestone bedrock beneath the alluvial plain. Springs emerge where fractures in the rock allow underground water to reach the surface. Wells dug almost anywhere reach fresh water at relatively shallow depth. The entire landscape is underlain by water moving slowly through porous stone, emerging occasionally at springs, sustaining marshlands, feeding the agriculture that made Sumerian civilization possible. To people who lacked geologic understanding, this underground water might indeed seem like an ocean. Dig anywhere, and eventually you reach it. It extends beneath everything. It connects all surface water, and it's deep. The aquifer systems extend hundreds of feet down, far beyond anything ancient well digging could reach. From their perspective, the description was accurate. A vast underground water system source of all fresh water, immeasurably deep. The texts assign this entire system to Enki. He governs it, controls it, dwells within it. His temple at Eridu sits directly over it. The Abzu, literally House of the Abzu, is described as having foundations that reach down into the waters. The building connects the surface world to the subterranean ocean. Enki can move between temple and Abzu freely. The structure serves as interface. If we accept this description literally, what would it require? Architecture that penetrates deep enough to reach groundwater, chambers or shafts extending below the water table, some means of accessing underground water while maintaining structural integrity. The technology sounds impossible for mud brick architecture in the 4th millennium BC, yet the texts insist it was done. Archaeological evidence from Eridu is incomplete. The site has been partially excavated, but large sections remain unexcavated. What has been exposed shows the expected temple sequences, those 18 superimposed levels we discussed earlier, but foundation depths are difficult to determine because excavations stopped at hard layers that required equipment unavailable to early 20th century archaeology. No one has fully explored how deep the earliest temple foundations go, or whether chambers or structures exist beneath the lowest excavated levels, but foundation shafts were technologically possible. Other ancient cultures dug deep wells, constructed underground chambers, excavated cisterns and tombs that penetrated dozens of feet below surface. The engineering challenge is significant but not insurmountable. If the builders of Eridu wanted to access the groundwater directly, to create structural connection between temple and aquifer, they possessed the technology to attempt it. The question is, why? The religious answer is straightforward, because Enki dwells in the Abzu, and the temple must connect to Enki's domain. But that's circular reasoning. It explains the architecture with the mythology, and the mythology with the architecture. If we step outside that loop and ask functional questions, other possibilities emerge. Underground water systems have distinctive properties. Temperature remains constant year-round. In Mesopotamia, roughly 20-22 degrees Celsius, regardless of surface conditions. Humidity stabilizes. Acoustic properties change. Sound behaves differently in chambers connected to water-filled cavities. Certain materials exhibit altered conductivity when in proximity to groundwater. If your purpose requires stable environmental conditions or specific acoustic or electromagnetic properties, situating structures over aquifers provides advantages. Modern technology exploits this. Geothermal systems use underground temperature stability for heating and cooling. Certain scientific instruments require vibration isolation provided by deep foundations extending to bedrock below water tables. Acoustic properties of caves and underground spaces are utilized in everything from music halls to secure communication facilities. The idea that underground water systems might serve functions beyond drinking water is not speculative, it's engineering. Did the Sumerians recognize such properties? The text suggests they did. Enki is described as god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and secret knowledge. His domain is the depths. His powers include things hidden, things profound, things requiring special knowledge to access. He grants intelligence, technical skill, and understanding to humans. From his position in the Abzu, he observes all that occurs on Earth's surface. The water connects everything, and Enki, dwelling within the water, perceives through those connections. This is remarkably similar to modern concepts of sensor networks. Distributed monitoring systems positioned throughout a region, connected by communication infrastructure, feeding data to central processing locations. The Abzu could function similarly, a natural network of interconnected water systems spanning Mesopotamia, with temples positioned over key nodes, serving as access points to the larger system. That interpretation sounds like science fiction, but consider what the texts actually describe: a subterranean system, permanent, pre-existing, natural, with a being who dwells within it, who perceives through it, who can communicate through it to humans, at temples built over specific access points. That's infrastructure. It's a description of functioning technology using available vocabulary. The Abzu temple at Eridu was not the only structure described as connecting to the Abzu. Multiple temples claim similar connection. The sacred precinct at Nippur supposedly included access to the underground waters. Temples at Uruk, at Lagash, describe themselves as having foundations in the deep, as connecting Earth and Abzu. The pattern suggests a network of sites positioned over aquifer systems, possibly over specific features like springs or fault zones where water movement is particularly active. There's archaeological evidence for this positioning. Many major Sumerian temples were built near water sources, rivers, canals, springs. The standard explanation is practical. Cities need water, so temples were built in cities, therefore temples are near water. But the persistence of specific locations argues against pure convenience. When temples were rebuilt after destruction, they returned to the exact previous location, even if that location was no longer optimal for practical reasons. Even if the river had shifted, the old canal was silted, better sites existed nearby. Something about those precise coordinates mattered. If temples functioned as interfaces to a monitoring system based on aquifer networks, precise positioning would be critical. The structure must be over the right geological features. Moving even short distances might lose connection to the network. This would explain why temple locations remained fixed for millennia despite changing political, economic, and environmental conditions. The locations weren't chosen for convenience, they were chosen for access. Enki's role in this system matches what we might call network administration. He governs the Abzu, controls access to it, determines what information flows through it, and decides what humans can access. He grants the Me, those mysterious divine powers, to cities and rulers, but always from his position in the Abzu. The Me are described as physical objects that can be stolen, carried, or installed. In Sumerian mythological accounts, Inanna steals the Me from Enki and brings them to Uruk. Enki objects, but ultimately allows it. The transaction reads like data transfer, like granting system access, like installing software. This interpretation stretches. We're reading ancient religious texts through technological metaphor, but the metaphor fits surprisingly well. The consistent descriptions across hundreds of texts suggest the Sumerians weren't inventing fictions, they were describing systems they observed and participated in, but perhaps didn't fully understand. Their vocabulary was religious because that was the framework available for describing interaction with beings more knowledgeable than themselves, with systems beyond their construction capability, with infrastructure they inherited and maintained but didn't create. The Abzu existed. That's not speculation. Aquifers underlie Mesopotamia. The question is whether anyone deliberately exploited those aquifers for purposes beyond water supply, whether temples were positioned over them intentionally, whether structures like the Abzu were designed to interface with underground water systems to enable functions we haven't identified. The texts insist this was the case. Enki dwells below, in the waters, perceiving through them, connected through them to temples above. The temples enable that connection. They're built specifically to access what lies beneath. And the beings who dwell in that realm, who govern those waters, who move through them, who observe through them, maintain awareness of surface activities through infrastructure humans were taught to build and instructed to maintain. That network, if it existed, would still be there. Aquifers don't disappear. They shift slowly over geological time, but across mere thousands of years they remain stable. The temples above might be ruins, the access shafts collapsed or filled, the maintenance stopped, but the Abzu beneath endures. The water still flows through limestone cavities, the connections between distant regions still exist. Whether anything still uses those connections, still monitors through that system, still observes through infrastructure 5,000 years old, we stopped maintaining it, so we wouldn't know. But someone knew enough to build it in the first place. Someone understood groundwater systems well enough to position temples over optimal access points. Someone designed architecture that connected surface structures to subsurface features. The Sumerians credit Enki, the dweller in the Abzu, with teaching them this knowledge. Perhaps he was describing his own address, 300 in heaven, 300 on earth. The Enuma Elish is not a creation myth in the way that term is usually understood. It's an organizational charter. 7 tablets detailing cosmic history, divine hierarchy, and administrative structure. The text was recited annually during the Akitu festival in Babylon, celebrating the new year and reaffirming the social order. But buried within its mythological language are passages that sound less like poetry and more like bureaucratic documentation. Tablet Psyche, lines 39-44, preserved on fragments housed in the British Museum's K-Series collection, contains one of these passages. After establishing Babylon as cosmic capital and constructing Esagila as Marduk's temple, the text describes the division of the Anunnaki gods. Marduk organizes them into 2 groups. 300 are assigned to heaven, 300 to earth. The division is precise, numerical, functional. It describes job assignments. The term Anunnaki appears throughout Mesopotamian texts spanning nearly 3,000 years. In Sumerian sources, it typically refers to great gods, offspring of Anu and Ki. In later Akkadian texts, the designation expands. Anunnaki are divine beings with authority, distinct from lesser spirit categories. They can be in heaven or earth or the underworld. They have tasks. They perform functions. They're not abstract spiritual forces, they're more like officials, administrators with defined roles and jurisdictions. The number 600 appears repeatedly, not approximate many, but specific 600. 300 in heaven means 300 specific positions, presumably with 300 beings filling those roles. 300 on earth similarly suggests specific assignments, specific individuals. The organization is structured. Someone tracks this. Someone knows who is assigned where. Mainstream interpretation treats this numerology as symbolic. 600 represents completeness or totality in Mesopotamian number symbolism. It's a way of saying many or all the gods. The division into 2 equal groups represents cosmic balance, the mirroring of heaven and earth in divine administration. These are reasonable interpretations within the framework that treats ancient religious texts as mythology, stories explaining the world through symbolic narrative. But the texts themselves don't present this information symbolically. The language is administrative. After dividing the Anunnaki, the text describes their work. Those assigned to heaven maintain celestial functions. Those assigned to earth perform earthly tasks. Then something remarkable happens. The Anunnaki on earth complain. The work is too difficult. They petition for relief. Marduk responds by creating humans to serve as workers, taking over tasks the Anunnaki find burdensome. This is not creation of humans as special spiritual beings. It's workforce management. The Anunnaki need labour assistance, so a worker species is created to specifications that enable them to perform required tasks. The text provides details. Humans are fashioned from clay, mixed with divine essence of a sacrificed god, giving them limited capabilities but sufficient intelligence for their purpose. They're deployed across regions where the Anunnaki need assistance. They reproduce, multiplying their numbers. The system is functional. Other Mesopotamian texts expand this framework. The Atrahasis epic describes similar events but adds population management concerns. Humans multiply too successfully, becoming noisy and disruptive. The Anunnaki Council, meeting to address the problem, considers various solutions including plague, famine, and eventually flood. These are administrative decisions made by committee, debated, voted upon. The bureaucratic process is detailed. We hear about factions, disagreements, procedural irregularities. Enki objects to the flood plan, warns a human named Atrahasis to build a boat, and is later censured for interfering. The account reads like meeting minutes, like documentation of organisational decisions. It presents the Anunnaki not as mysterious cosmic forces, but as beings with personalities, agendas, political relationships. They form factions. They disagree. They circumvent official decisions through technicalities. Enki warns Atrahasis by speaking to a wall, which the human overhears, allowing Enki to claim he didn't directly violate the council's decision to keep the flood secret. This level of detail suggests the texts derive from something other than pure invention. Either they're sophisticated political allegory, reflecting human governmental structures through divine metaphor, or they're records, accounts of actual events recorded by people who witnessed them, translated into available vocabulary, transmitted through generations, eventually codified in permanent form on clay tablets. The division of Anunnaki between heaven and earth creates functional questions. If 300 are on Earth, where specifically are they? The texts don't provide comprehensive lists, but they do assign particular gods to particular cities. Enki to Eridu, Enlil to Nippur, Anu to Uruk, Nana to Ur-Marduk to Babylon. These are jurisdictional assignments. Each god governs a specific territory, oversees specific functions, resides at a specific temple. The math suggests something interesting. At Mesopotamia's height, dozens of major cities existed, each with primary temples to patron deities. If we add smaller settlements with temples, the number of sacred sites approaches 300. This could be coincidence, but the tablets sometimes describe themselves as census documents, as lists ensuring all positions are filled and all territories covered. The administrative structure they describe would require distributed presence, officials stationed throughout the supervised region. That's standard organisational practice for governance of large territories. Central authority delegates to regional administrators who maintain local presence. Communication systems connect the network. Reports flow upward, instructions flow downward. The system requires infrastructure, administrative centres, communication pathways, record-keeping facilities. In ancient Mesopotamia, that infrastructure was temples. They served as administrative hubs, maintained archives, trained scribes, housed officials. If we read the texts literally, if the Anunnaki were actual beings performing actual governance, temples become more than religious structures. They're regional offices, staffed positions, and the 300 assigned to Earth would be distributed across those positions, each responsible for specific territories, specific functions, specific aspects of what the texts call world order. The tablets describe this order, called me in Sumerian, as requiring active maintenance. It doesn't sustain itself. The me must be protected, renewed, properly administered. Kings receive the me from gods during coronation ceremonies. Cities obtain me through divine favour. Losing the me leads to decline and collapse. The concept pervades Mesopotamian thought. Civilization requires constant divine input, constant maintenance of proper relationships between human and divine authorities. What if that wasn't theology, but description? What if the me were actual systems, knowledge, technology, administrative frameworks, requiring instruction and maintenance from those who established them? The text described me as transferable, as objects that can be stolen or granted. They list specific me, kingship, priesthood, metallurgy, writing, music, construction, law. These are technologies and social structures, skills and knowledge, things that must be taught. Human societies develop these capabilities independently through long cultural evolution, but Mesopotamian sources insist theirs were granted. taught by the Anunnaki. The 7 sages, semi-divine beings who predated the flood, came from the sea and taught humanity arts and sciences. Enki granted wisdom, technical knowledge, magical understanding. The gods established kingship, taught temple construction, revealed astronomical knowledge. The texts credit external sources for virtually every foundational element of Sumerian civilization. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as origin mythology, attributing cultural achievements to divine origins to legitimize them. But legitimation works differently. It typically claims ancient inheritance from heroic ancestors, not from currently present gods who might be asked uncomfortable questions. If Sumerian kings claimed descent from divine instructors no longer present, that would be convenient mythology. But they claimed relationship with gods who dwelled in nearby temples, who could be petitioned, whose responses could be observed. That's riskier. It invites verification. The texts also describe withdrawal. After the flood, divine presence changes. The Anunnaki become less visible, less directly involved. Humans must manage more independently. But the structure remains. The temples, the hierarchies, the administrative frameworks. Humans continue operating systems established during the period of direct divine governance, maintaining them according to instructions that become tradition, ritual, religious law. This pattern resembles infrastructure handoff. An organization establishes systems, trains local operators, then reduces direct presence while monitoring remotely. The systems continue functioning. The operators maintain them according to training. The original designers retain oversight capability but don't require constant on-site presence. That reduces resource commitment while preserving control. If the 300 Anunnaki assigned to Earth operated this way, much of what we observe in the archaeological record makes sense. The temple network provides monitoring infrastructure. The astronomical observation programs feed data to that infrastructure. The precise architectural specifications ensure systems function correctly. The continuous rebuilding maintains the network across centuries. And humans, trained in temple administration, astronomical observation, and proper ritual, unknowingly operate monitoring systems while believing they're serving gods. The gods might still be served, but the service might be more technical than spiritual. Maintaining alignments, recording observations, preserving specific locations, performing procedures that keep ancient systems functional. The religious framework provides motivation and cultural stability, ensuring the work continues across generations. But the work itself, the precise, technical, systematic work, serves purposes the participants may not fully understand. 300 positions distributed across Mesopotamia and nearby regions. Temples marking those positions. Astronomical observatories providing data. Foundation deposits marking coordinates. Aquifer access enabling subterranean network connections. Priestly bureaucracies maintaining everything according to specifications provided millennia ago. And somewhere in heaven, according to the texts, meaning perhaps above, beyond direct visibility, 300 more, receiving data, monitoring, observing. 600 total. Specific number, specific organization, maintained across 3,000 years of continuous civilization. Then, gradually withdrawal. The systems continue, the temples remain, the alignments hold, but direct administration fades. Humans inherit the infrastructure without inheriting full understanding of its purpose. What remains now are ruins and texts, foundation deposits buried beneath sand, astronomical tablets catalogued in museums, king lists describing impossible reigns, creation accounts detailing administrative decisions, all of it documentation of something. The question is, what? Mythology or minutes, theology or technical manuals? The Anunnaki were divided, 300 above, 300 below. The texts insist this is so. We can interpret that symbolically, or we can calculate 300 positions across Mesopotamia, each marked by a temple, each maintained across millennia, each connected to networks of observation and communication, infrastructure for monitoring, still positioned, still aligned, still there. Whether still occupied is another question. The me, powers that can be transferred. The list survives in several versions, but the most complete appears in the text called Inanna and Enki, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period. Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu to visit Enki in his Abzu temple. Enki, apparently in generous or possibly intoxicated mood, offers her the me. She accepts. He gives her more. She accepts those too. By the time Enki sobers, Inanna has loaded over 100 me onto her boat and is sailing back to Uruk. Enki attempts to retrieve them, sending servants to stop her, but Inanna's assistant, Ninshuba, defends the cargo. The me reach Uruk and are installed there, permanently transferring those capabilities to Inanna's city. The text lists the me in detail: kingship, priesthood, truth, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of prostitution, the art of judgment, the art of metalworking, the art of leatherworking, the art of building, the art of basket weaving, wisdom, understanding, treachery, the rebel lands, kindness, justice, the craft of the woodworker, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker, fear, terror, strife, peace, weariness, victory, counsel, the troubled heart, judgment, decision-making, musical instruments, standards, holy sceptres, staffs, shrines, shepherdship, kingship, lasting leadership, divine leadership, the Gudashu garment, the priestly office of Ishib, the priestly office of Luma, the priestly office of Guda, truth, plundering of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, falsehood, the rebel lands, goodness, justice, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver. The list continues, mixing what we'd classify as technologies working, construction, social roles in ship, preet-hit, emotional states, fear, peace, and abstract concepts truth. The mixture seems random until you realise all of these are components of complex civilization: skills, organisational structures, emotional frameworks, technical capabilities, everything required to operate a sophisticated society. And the text treats them as objects, physical things that can be loaded onto boats, carried between cities, stolen, granted, installed. Not metaphorical objects, not spiritual abstractions, objects. Inanna doesn't receive instruction in metalworking. She receives the metalworking me. Once installed in Uruk, her city possesses metalworking capability. The me is both the knowledge and the authorization, and the capability bundled into something transferable. This is strange. Knowledge isn't typically described as portable objects. We teach knowledge, we write it down, we demonstrate techniques, but we don't speak of loading knowledge onto boats or installing it in cities. Yet that's precisely how the text describes the process. The me have physical presence. They occupy space. They can be moved from location to location. Once installed, they remain functional until removed or destroyed. The closest modern analogy might be software licenses. You can have the knowledge of how software works without having authorization to use it. Authorization is a separate thing, often physically embodied in license keys, certificates, or hardware dongles. Transfer the license, and you transfer capability even if the underlying knowledge was always available. The me functions similarly, their authorization and capability combined, granted by those with authority to grant them, installed in locations where they enable specific functions. But who has authority to grant them? According to the texts, the gods do. Specifically, Enki holds the me initially. He possesses the collection. Other gods obtain me from him or from each other through various transactions. Humans receive me through divine favour. Gods grant kingship, priesthood, craft skills to selected individuals or cities. The me flow downward hierarchically from Enki to other gods, to cities, to humans. But they can also flow horizontally or even upward through theft, trickery or negotiation. They're assets, controllable, distributable, transferable. This administrative framework suggests the me aren't just knowledge, they're access, authorization to perform functions within a managed system. Kingship isn't merely political authority a human claims through force, it's a me granted by divine authority. Without the me of kingship, your rule is illegitimate. With it, even if you seized power through violence, you possess proper authorization. The divine realm recognizes your status. Similarly, with technical skills, metalworking isn't just knowledge of heating ore and hammering it into shape. It's a me, a capability granted to specific cities and individuals. Texts describe cities famous for particular crafts, possessing me that other cities lack. This could reflect natural distribution of resources and skills. Some regions have copper deposits, some have skilled artisans. But the texts frame it as possession of me. The capability is located in specific places because the me are installed there. What would it mean for technical capabilities to require authorization? One possibility: the underlying systems are proprietary. Someone established them, owns them, controls access. You can't use advanced metallurgy without authorization because the knowledge is restricted. This sounds paranoid until you remember that throughout human history, technical knowledge has been closely guarded. Guilds kept craft secrets. States controlled strategic resources. Monopolies on specific capabilities provided political and economic power. The idea that civilizations' foundational technologies might be controlled similarly isn't alien, it's standard practice. Another possibility: the me aren't just knowledge, but infrastructure access. Metalworking requires not just technique, but materials, tools, fuel, markets. Perhaps the me represent authorization to access resource networks. Granted the me of metalworking, you gain access to copper sources, trade routes for tin, markets for finished goods. The knowledge is useless without the network. The me grant network access. This interpretation aligns with the text's emphasis on trade and exchange. Mesopotamian civilization depended on long-distance trade. They had few metal deposits, limited timber, insufficient stone for building. Everything was imported from distant regions. The trade networks that supplied these materials were organized, regulated, controlled, perhaps by temples which administered both religious and economic functions, perhaps by the divine authorities those temples served. If the Anunnaki established Mesopotamian civilization, they would need to establish supply chains, identify resource locations, arrange extraction and transport, distribute materials to cities where they'd be processed, manage the entire network. An authorization to access that network, to receive copper shipments, to trade for tin, to export finished goods would be valuable, worth recording as divine gifts, worth fighting over, worth stealing, as Inanna stole the me from Enki. The theft itself is suspicious. Why would Enki, god of wisdom, give away critical capabilities while drunk? Why wouldn't he simply take them back once sober? The text says he tried but failed. Inanna's defences were too effective. But Enki governs the Abzu, controls underground waters, possesses vast power. Inanna is formidable, but not more powerful than Enki. His inability to retrieve the me suggests either the transfer was legitimate, once given, me can't be forcibly reclaimed, or Enki's attempt was half-hearted, perhaps because the redistribution served larger purposes. Later in Mesopotamian history, Power did shift from Eridu to Uruk. Uruk became preeminent. Eridu declined. The mythological account of Inanna stealing the me and transferring them to Uruk matches the historical pattern. Administrative authority relocated. Perhaps the me theft wasn't theft at all, but formal transfer of authority recorded in narrative form because bureaucratic documentation didn't make compelling stories. But the me themselves, what they actually were physically, remains unexplained. The text described them with physical language, but never showed them. No one catalogues their appearance. No artisan creates replicas. We have thousands of artifacts from Mesopotamia, statues, jewellery, weapons, tools, but nothing labelled this is a me. They're strangely absent for objects treated as central to civilization. Unless they weren't objects humans could perceive or replicate, unless they were technological artifacts from a more advanced culture, incomprehensible to Bronze Age populations, described in the only terms available, divine powers, magical objects, gifts from gods. Ancient astronaut theorists propose exactly this interpretation. The me were alien technology granted to humans by extraterrestrial visitors. The mainstream dismisses this as pseudoscience, but the texts insist the me were real, transferable, and functional. They enabled capabilities, they could be moved, they required protection, they were valuable enough that goddesses stole them and gods fought over them. Something physical must correspond to these descriptions, even if we can't identify what. Perhaps the me were information, not carved tablets or written scrolls, but some method of encoding and transferring knowledge that we've lost. The texts say they were collected by Enki, suggesting they existed independently before he gathered them. They could be granted individually or in groups. They functioned once installed in appropriate locations. This sounds like modular information storage, libraries, archives, databases in some form we don't recognise archaeologically because we're looking for the wrong artefacts. Or perhaps they were authorization codes, administrative credentials, access keys to systems the Anunnaki controlled. Granted a me, you could access resources, perform functions, exercise authority within the managed system. The me wasn't the capability itself, but the permission to use capabilities the system provided. This interpretation treats Mesopotamian civilization as infrastructure dependent, operating within frameworks established by previous administrators who granted selective access. Either way, the me represents something strange, transferable capabilities that functioned like objects, but might not have been physical in ways we understand. They were central to how Mesopotamians conceptualized civilization's origins. Every major capability, every foundational technology, every social structure was a me, granted by gods, installed in cities, maintained through proper ritual. Remove the me and the capability disappears. Lose divine favour and you lose the me. Possess the me and you can accomplish things otherwise impossible. Inanna brought the me to Uruk, and Uruk flourished. The city became the largest in the world for its time, pioneering urban planning, monumental architecture, and complex administration. Coincidence or consequence? Did possessing the me enable Uruk's achievements, or did Uruk's success lead to stories about possessing the me? The text suggests causation flows from divine to human. Gods established capabilities, granted access, enabled civilization. Humans operated within those grants, maintaining systems according to divine instruction. The me were the interface, the mechanism by which capabilities flowed from those who possessed them originally to those authorized to use them. If someone established Mesopotamian civilization, if infrastructure was built and systems deployed and authority distributed, we'd expect evidence of exactly what the texts describe: transferable authorizations, managed access, hierarchical distribution of capabilities. The me, physical or informational, primitive or advanced, theological or technological, they represent something. The Sumerians weren't inventing random mythology, they were recording what they experienced. and what they experienced was civilization granted from above, capabilities installed by authorization, systems they maintained but didn't create. The me remain unexplained, but their function is clear. They were how gods gave civilization to humans, piece by piece, capability by capability, me by me. Someone had them to give. Someone possessed them first. Someone transferred them deliberately, maintaining control while distributing access. That someone was the Anunnaki, according to every text addressing the question. The me came from them. Perhaps, in ways we haven't detected, they never entirely left. Nippur, the bond between heaven and earth. For 3,000 years, every conqueror who swept through Mesopotamia, every dynasty that rose to power, every king who claimed sovereignty over the land, all of them honoured Nippur. They didn't conquer it, they endowed it. They rebuilt its temples, they made pilgrimages to its sacred precinct, they left offerings, they claimed Enlil's blessing, obtained through petition at Nippur, without which no rule was legitimate. This happened consistently from the earliest Sumerian city-states, through the Akkadian Empire, through the Ur-3 dynasty, through Babylonian supremacy, through Kassite rule, through Assyrian conquest, into the Persian period. 3 millennia of unbroken sanctity despite continuous political upheaval. Why? Nippur held no strategic military position. It sat inland, away from major trade routes. It controlled no vital resources. Its agricultural base was adequate, but not exceptional. It was never a political capital after the very earliest periods. Rulers maintained their palaces elsewhere, at Ur, at Akkad, at Babylon, at Nineveh. Yet they treated Nippur as if it held something irreplaceable, something worth protecting, regardless of political considerations. The University of Pennsylvania excavations, conducted between 1889 and 1900, exposed the Ichor Temple Complex, House Mountain, sacred to Enlil, chief of the Sumerian pantheon. The excavation reports document extraordinary findings: approximately 25,000 cuneiform tablets, the largest single collection recovered from any Mesopotamian site. The tablets catalogue everything imaginable: astronomical observations, mathematical texts, literary works, administrative documents, ritual instructions, economic records. Nippur functioned as something like a central archive, preserving information from across Mesopotamian civilization. But the site's significance predated any of those tablets. The earliest occupation levels at Nippur date to the Ubaid period, approximately 5000 BCE. Temple construction began soon after, and from that point forward, the location remained sacred. 7,000 years of continuous religious importance. Even after the city itself declined in population, even when it was barely inhabited, pilgrims came, offerings were made, the temples were maintained. Something about this specific location commanded reverence beyond cultural or political factors. The tablets describe Nippur as the bond between heaven and earth, as the place where Enlil decreed destinies, where divine judgments were issued, where cosmic order was maintained. The language is consistent across hundreds of texts. Nippur isn't just sacred, it's functionally necessary. The proper ordering of the world depends on it. Kings require Enlil's blessing from Nippur to legitimize their rule. Without it, they're usurpers, regardless of military power or popular support. Mainstream interpretation treats this as political religious ideology. Nippur's priesthood, by controlling access to legitimation, gained power disproportionate to the city's material resources. Ambitious rulers paid for that legitimation through generous endowments, maintaining Nippur's privileged status. The system was self-reinforcing. Nippur granted legitimacy. Rulers rewarded Nippur, enhancing its prestige, making its legitimation more valuable, ensuring continued rewards. A successful racket maintained for 3,000 years. But that interpretation requires explaining why every dynasty honoured it, why no conqueror decided to establish a new legitimation centre under his own control. why no ruler, possessing absolute power, simply declared Nippur's authority void and established himself without traditional blessing. That would be the practical move for an ambitious tyrant. Yet no one did it. Not once in 3 millennia. Even conquerors from outside Mesopotamian culture, Persians who worshipped different gods, still paid respect to Nippur. The consistency suggests something more than ideology. Either Nippur possessed some property that made it genuinely necessary, or the beings who demanded its respect, the gods, the Anunnaki, enforced consequences for violating its sanctity. If legitimation truly required something Nippur provided, something technological or systematic that couldn't be replicated elsewhere, then even cynical rulers would participate. You can't fake system access. You either have proper authorization or you don't. Consider Nippur's geographic position. It sits near the center of alluvial Mesopotamia, roughly equidistant from the Persian Gulf to the south and the uplands of northern Iraq. It's positioned where ancient Euphrates and Tigris channels converged, creating what was once ideal agricultural land fed by multiple water sources. Below the city, extensive aquifer systems interconnect throughout the region. Nippur sits atop a major node in that underground network. If the hypothesis we've been exploring has merit, if temples functioned as interfaces to monitoring systems based on aquifer connections, Nippur's position would be strategic. It's centrally located for observation coverage of the entire Mesopotamian plain. Underground water systems radiating from Nippur could connect to every major settlement in the region. A monitoring hub positioned there would have optimal access to data from distributed sites. The tablets recovered from Nippur support this interpretation. Astronomical observations from multiple cities, mathematical tables for calculations, administrative documents from distant locations, economic records spanning the entire region, literary texts collecting knowledge from various traditions. Nippur accumulated information from everywhere. It functioned as a central repository, gathering data, preserving it, processing it. The temple complex served as an institutional center where information flowed. But information requires transmission. How did tablets from reach Nippur? How did astronomical data from Babylon arrive at the Eka? The standard answer: messengers carried them. Scribes travelled between cities. Tablets were copied and distributed through normal diplomatic and commercial channels. This is certainly true. We have records of such exchanges. But the volume of information concentrated at Nippur seems disproportionate to what physical tablet transport could easily explain. Unless tablets were transcriptions, local observations recorded on clay, documenting data that was transmitted through other means. The clay tablets were backups, archives, permanent storage of information that moved through the system in forms we haven't identified. The Abzu network, if it functioned as earlier chapters proposed, could serve as communication infrastructure. Data collected at distributed temple sites, transmitted through underground aquifer connections to the central node at Nippur, recorded there by scribes who created permanent archives. This sounds speculative until you examine what's required for system operation. Distributed observation generates data. That data must reach processing centers. Without electronic transmission, ancient civilizations used messengers, signal fires, courier networks. But those systems are slow, expensive, and limited in bandwidth. An alternative communication method, one utilizing natural features like water systems as conductive pathways, would dramatically improve information flow. Modern technology uses similar principles. Fiber optic cables are laid along underwater routes because water submersion provides protection and stability. Sound waves travel efficiently through water. Whales communicate across entire oceans through low-frequency vocalizations transmitted via water. Electrical signals propagate through conductive media, including water with dissolved minerals. The idea that underground water systems could serve communication functions isn't fantasy, it's physics. Did the Sumerians understand this? They understood that Enki, god of the Abzu, knew everything. That information reached the gods through mysterious means. That priests performed rituals enabling divine communication. That temples positioned over water sources had special properties. Whether they understood the technical mechanisms or simply followed procedures that worked is uncertain. But the procedures existed, and they centered on locations like Nippur, sites where water, architecture, and ritual combined to enable functions the texts describe as divine communication. Enlil at Nippur decreed destinies. He pronounced judgments. He issued commands that other gods and all humans obeyed. The language suggests not spiritual wisdom, but administrative authority. Enlil held system administrator privileges. Commands issued from Nippur carried authorization that couldn't be overridden locally. You could disobey, but your disobedience would be recorded, would have consequences, would be adjudicated according to protocols Enlil controlled. This interpretation treats Mesopotamian religion as interface language for a managed system. The gods weren't supernatural beings in distant heaven, but authorities operating through network infrastructure centered at Nippur. Prayers were petitions routed through the system. Offerings were network fees. Rituals were authentication protocols. And legitimation, the blessing of Enlil obtained at Nippur, was authorization granted to those who complied with system requirements. That framework explains Nippur's persistence. You can't relocate a central hub without rebuilding the entire network. The infrastructure was positioned around Nippur. Temples throughout Mesopotamia connected to it. Moving the center would require reconfiguring all distributed sites. Expensive, technically difficult, possibly beyond human capability. Easier to maintain the existing system. Pay the network fees. Seek proper authorization. Operate within the established framework. And conquerors, whatever their origin, needed to operate within that framework if they wanted their administration to function. Raw military power lets you destroy things, occupy territory, intimidate populations, but governing complex civilization requires information systems, economic networks, communication infrastructure. If those systems were embedded in temple frameworks centered on Nippur, conquerors had to accommodate them. You can't rule what you can't administer. You can't administer without access to administrative infrastructure. Access required legitimation. Legitimation came from Nippur, so every conqueror endowed the Eka. Every dynasty honoured Enlil. Every king sought blessing from the priests at Nippur who controlled access to whatever system the temple interface served. The sanctity wasn't spiritual, it was practical. Nippur worked. It provided necessary functions. Violating it meant losing access to those functions. Maintaining it meant your administration could operate effectively. 3,000 years of consistent behaviour, despite radical changes in who held power, suggests the system was robust. Either it truly functioned independently of human control, God/Anunnaki enforcing their own authority, or it was engineered so well that humans couldn't circumvent it. Built so deeply into Mesopotamian infrastructure that circumvention required rebuilding civilization from scratch, which no conqueror had resources or motivation to attempt. The Eka is gone now, reduced to eroded foundations and scattered bricks. The tablets were removed to museums, dispersed across institutions worldwide. The aquifer systems beneath Nippur still exist, still connect to water networks spanning the region. The geography hasn't changed. What changed is maintenance. Humans stopped honouring Nippur, stopped making offerings, stopped seeking legitimation. The system, if it existed, was abandoned by its users. Whether it still functions is unknowable. Whether data still flows through underground pathways to a processing centre no one staffs anymore is speculation. But the infrastructure was built for durability. The foundations were laid deep. The connections were permanent. And the texts insist that Nippur was the bond between heaven and earth, the interface enabling communication, administration, an observation. Bonds don't break simply because we ignore them. Infrastructure doesn't vanish because we stop using it. Nippur remains. The position remains. The alignment remains. Whether anyone still watches through that alignment, through architecture built 7,000 years ago by people claiming divine instruction, through foundations that connect surface temples to underground waters called the Abzu, that question remains unanswered. But the question wouldn't exist if Nippur had been just another city, just another temple, just another example of religious architecture. It was something more. For 3 millennia, everyone agreed on that. They couldn't explain it, but they honoured it. They protected it. They maintained it. They recognized that something about Nippur transcended politics and culture, something that persists even now, beneath the sand of central Iraq, at the ruins of a temple where destinies were once decreed, kings who reigned before the flood. The Weld Blundell Prism, catalogue number AN 1923-444 in the Ashmolean Museum, is a clay prism approximately 8 inches tall with 4 sides, each inscribed with columns of cuneiform text. It's the most complete surviving version of the Sumerian king list, compiled around 1800 BCE, but recording much older traditions. The text begins simply, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Then it lists rulers, 8 kings in 5 cities, ruling before the flood. Their reigns are specified numerically. Alulim ruled 28,800 years in Eridu. Al-Algar ruled 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled 43,200 years in Bad Tibera. And Mengelana ruled 28,800 years. The numbers continue through 8 rulers, totaling 241,200 years of kingship before the flood swept over the land. These numbers are absurd. Humans don't live 28,000 years. Kingships don't last 43,000 years. The entire history of human civilization barely extends 10,000 years from the first agricultural settlements. The Sumerian king list appears to be fiction, mythology dressed as history, intended to provide divine legitimacy to historical rulers by connecting them to an impossibly ancient past. That's the mainstream interpretation, and it's reasonable. But the text itself presents these reigns as historical fact. It uses the same formulaic language for antediluvian kings as for historical rulers, whose reigns we can verify through other records. The style is consistent. The structure is bureaucratic. This king ruled this long in this city, then kingship passed to the next. After the flood, the list continues with dynasties we know existed. First dynasty of Uruk, first dynasty of Ur. Archaeological evidence confirms these later dynasties, their real history. So why append fictional prehistory to a historical king list? One possibility, the numbers aren't meant to be read as years. Ancient Mesopotamian mathematics used sexagesimal 60 notation. Numbers were expressed in complex systems involving multiple units of measurement. Scribes sometimes recorded numbers in forms that require interpretation. What appears as one unit might represent another. The large numbers in the antediluvian section might result from mathematical notation that later copyists misunderstood, mistranslating smaller figures into impossibly large ones. Scholars have attempted to resolve this by proposing the numbers represent months rather than years. Divide 28,800 by 12 and you get 2,400 years. Still impossibly long for a human reign, but less absurd. Or perhaps the numbers use different time units entirely. Seasons, lunar cycles, some measurement system lost to us. The problem with all these corrections is that the text doesn't indicate any unit other than years. The word used is mu, meaning year in Sumerian. If scribes meant months, they would write months. Another approach focuses on numerology. The numbers follow patterns. They're multiples of 3,600, which was a significant number in Mesopotamian mathematics, 1 sar, the largest unit in their counting system. Many of the reigns are simple multiples: 1 sar 3600, 2 sar 7200, 8 sar 28800, 12 sar 43200. This regularity suggests symbolic significance rather than literal chronology. Perhaps the numbers represent something like an age, with multiples indicating varying durations without specifying exact years. But these explanations all assume the scribes who compiled the king list were either confused or deliberately symbolic. They fail to address why confusion or symbolism would appear only in the antediluvian section. The post-flood portions use reasonable numbers, kings reigning 20, 30, 40 years, realistic human lifespans. If the scribes understood how to record plausible reign lengths for historical dynasties, why abandon plausibility for the earliest section unless they were recording information they believed accurate, numbers transmitted through tradition that made no sense but were faithfully preserved anyway? There's another element complicating interpretation: the flood. The king list explicitly divides history into pre- and post-flood periods. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This is not vague mythological background. It's a chronological marker. Events before the flood, events after the flood. Two distinct historical epochs separated by catastrophe. Geological evidence confirms that massive flooding occurred in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. Excavations at Uruk, Kish, and other sites reveal flood strata, layers of water deposited sediment interrupting cultural sequences. The floods weren't universal, but were severe and widespread across the alluvial plain. Settlements were destroyed, populations displaced. Then, after the waters receded, settlements were re-established. The archaeological record shows exactly what the king list describes: civilization before flood, destruction, civilization after flood. If the flood is real, historically verified, why assume the pre-flood kingship is fictional? Perhaps those 8 rulers existed, but the duration of their reigns was recorded in systems we don't understand. Or perhaps their reigns are compressed genealogies, each name representing a dynasty, with the numbers indicating dynasty duration rather than individual lifespans. This would make the antediluvian section less precise biography and more schematic genealogy, preserving memory of leadership sequences without detailed individual chronology. Or perhaps the numbers are accurate and we don't understand what's being measured. If kingship means something other than personal rule, if it indicates authority, jurisdiction, or administrative frameworks maintained across multiple generations, then duration could reflect institutional continuity rather than individual lifespans. Alulim's 28,800 years might mean the administrative framework he established endured that long, maintained by successors who inherited his position and title. This interpretation aligns with how later Mesopotamian rulers used titles. Sargon was a name adopted by multiple rulers across centuries. Hammurabi appears in documents spanning periods too long for one individual. Names might represent offices rather than persons. If antediluvian kings were positions inherited across generations, their reign durations could accumulate time across multiple individuals holding the same role, recorded collectively, because institutional memory preserved the office, but not every individual who filled it. But that still leaves the question, why record it at all? The king list's purpose was political legitimation. Rulers wanted to connect themselves to glorious past, to claim authority descended from legendary predecessors, including an incomprehensible prehistoric section listing rulers with impossible reign lengths, served that purpose only if those rulers had significance to the list's contemporary audience. If Alulim and Algar were recognised names, figures of authority whose legitimacy later dynasties wanted to claim connection to, then including them made political sense, and they were recognised names. Multiple Sumerian texts reference these antediluvian rulers, describe them as recipients of divine instruction, attribute them with founding cities and establishing institutions. They're not random inventions, they're integrated into the mythological and historical framework of Sumerian civilization. The tradition remembered them as having existed, as having ruled before the flood, as having inaugurated human kingship when it was lowered from heaven. That phrase, lowered from heaven, appears twice. Once before the flood, when kingship is established initially. Once after the flood, when kingship is restored. The language implies kingship isn't human invention, it's granted, instituted by divine action. The antediluvian kings weren't the first kings humans elected, or the first strongmen who seized power. They were the first humans authorized to rule, selected by gods/Anunnaki to govern according to divine frameworks. This matches descriptions from other texts. The seven sages, those mysterious beings who came from the sea before the flood and taught civilization, are sometimes described as serving during the reigns of the antediluvian kings. They provided instruction to those rulers, established temples, revealed knowledge. The kings administered, the sages taught. The system functioned until the flood disrupted it. Then kingship was lowered again, re-establishing governance, but in altered form. Post-flood humanity operates with less direct divine involvement, more independence, more responsibility for self-governance. The transition point matters. Pre-flood, long-reigning kings with direct divine guidance and presence of the sages. Post-flood, normal human lifespans, indirect divine communication, humans maintaining systems without constant supervision. The shift mirrors what we might expect if a civilization transitioned from direct management to autonomous operation. Initial setup requires intensive oversight. Once systems are established and operators are trained, management can become remote monitoring. The infrastructure persists, but daily operations are handled locally. If the Anunnaki organized antediluvian civilization, established kingship, instructed rulers, installed systems, the impossibly long reign lengths might reflect not confusion, but the fact that time was measured differently under direct Anunnaki presence. Perhaps their timekeeping system used different units. Perhaps records were kept in their notation and later translated into years without understanding the conversion factors. Perhaps 28,800 years accurately reflects some measurement that means something entirely different when properly interpreted. Or perhaps those reigns were genuinely far longer than we believe possible because the administrators weren't human. If kingship was lowered from heaven, if the early rulers were Anunnaki or Anunnaki human hybrids, their lifespans might exceed normal human duration. The text never explicitly states the antediluvian kings were human. It states they ruled, that kingship resided with them. Post-flood kings are clearly human. Their reign lengths match human lifespans. Pre-flood kings occupy an ambiguous category, humans authorized by gods, or gods governing directly. The king list provides no clarity. It simply records what tradition preserved: 8 rulers across 5 cities, reigning for durations that make no sense by ordinary standards. Before the flood erased that epoch. After the flood, kingship was lowered again, but something had changed. The rulers were fully human now, reigning reasonable durations, building dynasties in the recognizable historical pattern. The flood is the boundary. Before it, something we don't understand. After it, history as we recognize it. The king list marks that boundary explicitly, refusing to treat pre- and post-flood periods as continuous. They're separate epochs. Whatever system operated before the flood didn't operate identically afterward. Continuity existed, cities were rebuilt on the same locations, temple traditions continued, but under modified terms. Perhaps the Anunnaki withdrew then. Direct governance ended. remote monitoring began. Humans were left with infrastructure, training, instructions, but not constant presence. The impossibly long rains came from a period when time flowed differently, or was measured differently, or involved beings for whom human lifespan limits didn't apply. After the flood, humanity was on its own, maintaining systems, honouring gods who no longer appeared directly, preserving knowledge inherited from before the catastrophe. The King List documents this transition. It preserves memory of pre-flood governance, even though the numbers make no sense to us. It marks the flood as epochal boundary. It traces kingship through post-flood dynasties into the historical period when the list itself was compiled. And it begins by stating that kingship was lowered from heaven, granted, not invented. Humans didn't decide to have kings. The system was established for them, by whom is left implicit, but every Sumerian text answering the question says, the Anunnaki. They ruled before the flood, through human intermediaries or directly, for durations recorded in ways we can't interpret. Then the flood came, the epoch ended, and kingship was lowered again, but now humans had to manage it themselves, without the impossible reign lengths, without constant divine presence, just maintaining what was built before, according to instructions that survived in temple archives and priestly traditions, preserving systems from an age that reads like fantasy but was recorded as fact by people who valued precision and accuracy in documentation. The prism rests in its Oxford vault. The numbers remain impossible. The flood remains epochal. And the question remains, what kind of kingship reigns 28,800 years? Not human. But the text says kingship. Someone governed for those durations. Someone reigned before the flood. Someone whose tenure we can't comprehend, but whose authority was recognised enough to record, preserve and include in king lists compiled over 3,000 years later. Someone was there, before the flood, in cities we've excavated, under kingship lowered from heaven. The texts insist on this. The only question is whether we believe them. Star maps in clay. The tablet is fragmentary, broken at edges, but what survives is remarkable. Catalogue designation K8538, housed in the British Museum, dating to approximately 650 BC, but copying much older material. It's called the Babylonian Planisphere, a circular star map inscribed on clay, showing constellations, paths of planets, and notations that scholars have spent over a century attempting to fully decode. The tablet represents advanced astronomical knowledge, systematic observation, mathematical calculation, and integration of data from multiple sources. The mull.apn tablets, which we mentioned earlier, provide context. 2 tablets totaling approximately 1,000 lines of text, compiled around 1000 BCE, but recording observations spanning centuries before that. They list stars by position, track their rising and setting dates, calculate shadow lengths for time measurement, predict weather patterns based on celestial phenomena, describe planetary movements, and provide mathematical tables for astronomical calculation. This is systematic science conducted over generations, accumulated into reference works that served as training manuals and operational guides for temple astronomers. The Babylonian astronomical diaries extend this further. Beginning around 750 BC and continuing for approximately 600 years, these tablets provide nightly sky observations, planetary positions, lunar phases, eclipse records, meteorological notes, even commodity prices, creating integrated datasets linking celestial events with earthly conditions. The regularity is extraordinary. Night after night, year after year, century after century, someone observed and recorded. The continuity implies institutional programs, trained observers, maintained instruments, standardized procedures. Why undertake such programs? The practical answer: calendars and agriculture. Knowing seasonal transitions helps determine planting and harvest times. Predicting floods allows preparation. Tracking celestial cycles improves timekeeping. These are valid practical benefits. but they don't require 6 centuries of nightly observation. They don't demand mathematical precision to predict planetary positions years in advance. They don't explain why resources were invested in astronomical programs far exceeding practical agricultural needs. The tablets themselves suggest broader purposes. Many observations note celestial omens, unusual planetary conjunctions, comets, eclipses. These events were interpreted as divine communications, warnings or approvals related to earthly affairs. But omen interpretation requires baseline knowledge. You can't identify unusual events without knowing what's usual. The observational programs established that baseline, creating datasets so comprehensive that deviations became obvious. This transforms astronomy from passive sky watching to active monitoring. You're not just observing stars, you're watching for changes, anomalies, communications. The gods were believed to communicate through celestial signs. To receive those communications, you needed systems capable of detecting them. The observational programs provided that capability. They turned the sky into a communication channel, with priests trained to read messages encoded in planetary positions and stellar events. If the Anunnaki established this system, it makes functional sense. Remote monitoring requires information flow. Celestial phenomena, visible to anyone trained to observe them, could serve as signaling system. Unusual configurations could encode messages. Regular patterns could confirm system functionality, and the human observers, trained for generations in astronomical observation, would document everything, creating permanent records that could be analysed, cross-referenced, and used to track long-term patterns. The precision required for this monitoring is evident in the tablets. The mole.apn provides shadow length tables accurate enough for time measurement to fractional hours. The astronomical diaries record planetary positions precisely enough that modern astronomers use them to refine calculations of ancient orbital mechanics. This isn't casual observation, it's careful, systematic, scientifically rigorous data collection conducted with sophistication, matching anything achieved until the European scientific revolution 2 millennia later. How did they achieve this precision? Instruments first. Gnomon, vertical poles that cast shadows, allowing solar angle measurement. Water clocks for time measurement independent of sun position. Viewing devices for aligning sight lines to specific stars or horizon points. Angular measurement tools for calculating celestial coordinates. None of these are beyond Bronze Age technology. Careful craftsmanship and mathematical understanding suffice. The Mesopotamians possess both. But instruments alone don't produce sophisticated astronomy. You need theory, conceptual frameworks for understanding what you observe, mathematical methods for calculation, predictive models for determining future positions. The tablets document all of this. Tables of planetary periods, methods for calculating lunar phases, models of celestial motion. The underlying mathematics is impressive, solving problems that require algebraic thinking, understanding proportionality, manipulating complex numerical relationships. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard narrative suggests gradual accumulation. Observation over generations reveals patterns. Patterns suggest regularities. Regularities enable predictions. Errors in predictions motivate refinements. The cycle continues until sophisticated models emerge. This developmental process occurred in multiple civilizations, Chinese, Indian, Greek, Mesoamerican, supporting the idea that humans independently develop astronomical knowledge through persistent observation. But the Mesopotamian case shows peculiarities. The knowledge appears fully developed early. The earliest astronomical texts already demonstrate sophisticated understanding. There's no obvious developmental period where crude observations gradually improve. The system is already systematic when the written record begins. Either the development occurred pre-literacy, leaving no record, or the knowledge was imported from external sources. The texts credit external sources. The 7 sages brought wisdom from the sea before the flood. Enki granted understanding to select priests. The gods taught astronomy, mathematics, temple construction. These attributions are consistent across sources. Knowledge was received, not developed. Instruction was provided by beings possessing superior understanding. Humans learned, maintained, and transmitted what they were taught. This attribution pattern could be cultural bias. Societies often attribute important knowledge to divine or legendary sources. But it could also be accurate reporting. If beings with advanced astronomical knowledge resided in Mesopotamia during civilization's formative period, taught observation techniques, shared mathematical methods, and established institutional programs, humans would accurately record this as divine instruction. The knowledge would appear suddenly because it was introduced suddenly, not because records are incomplete. The observational programs also show network characteristics. Different cities maintained astronomical observations, but the data was shared. Tablets from Babylon reference observations made at Uruk. Records from Nippur incorporate data from Borsippa. The system was integrated, with multiple sites contributing to collective knowledge. No single temple possessed all astronomical knowledge. It was distributed across the network, with each site contributing observations, sharing findings, building comprehensive data sets. That's optimal design for monitoring networks. Distributed sensors provide coverage. Centralized processing synthesizes data. Redundancy ensures system continuity if individual sites fail. The Mesopotamian astronomical network shows exactly this structure: multiple observation sites across the region, systematic data collection, temple centers where information was compiled, archives preserving long-term records. A monitoring system wouldn't be designed differently. The purposes to which astronomical knowledge was put suggest monitoring beyond agricultural calendars. Omen texts describe planetary configurations associated with royal success or failure, with war outcomes, with floods, with social stability. These associations sound like superstition until you consider that they might reflect observed correlations. If celestial events coincided with earthly events repeatedly, the correlation would be noted. If those correlations proved predictive, if unusual planetary configurations reliably preceded floods or conflicts, they would constitute valid warning signs. Modern science recognizes some such correlations. Lunar cycles affect tides, solar cycles affect climate. Planetary gravitational interactions influence Earth's orbital parameters over long timescales. The Mesopotamians lacked theoretical understanding of gravitational mechanics, but they could observe correlations. And if they had assistance from beings who did understand celestial mechanics, they could be taught which correlations mattered, which configurations predicted which outcomes, without fully understanding why. The astronomical tablets, then, become something more than religious texts or primitive science. They're operational manuals, guides for system operators who needed to recognize significant events without necessarily understanding underlying mechanisms. The observations fed into monitoring systems. The omens were alerts, patterns requiring attention, configurations suggesting developments the Anunnaki wanted tracked. Human astronomers were trained to watch for these patterns, document them, and presumably report them through whatever communication channels the temple systems provided. That reporting might have been ritual. Certain ceremonies performed when specific celestial events occurred, priests reciting prescribed formulas, making offerings, performing procedures that from human perspective seemed religious, but from system perspective functioned as data transmission. The ritual language could encode information. The ceremony itself might activate monitoring systems, confirming that significant events were recognized and documented. This interpretation treats Mesopotamian astronomy as applied technology rather than proto-science. The observers weren't trying to understand the cosmos for pure intellectual curiosity. They were operating monitoring systems, performing assigned functions, maintaining programs established by others. The sophistication of their mathematics and observation reflects training quality and institutional continuity, not independent discovery. 6 centuries of astronomical diaries represent 6 centuries of systematic monitoring. The programs outlasted political changes, survived invasions, persisted through cultural shifts. Temple astronomers continued observing because observation was their function. They had been trained to it, their positions were hereditary, the work was funded by temple endowments that predated any contemporary dynasty. They observed because the system required observation, they recorded because records enabled pattern recognition. They maintained procedures because procedures were established by divine authority generations ago. Then, around the 2nd century BC, the astronomical diaries stop. No more nightly observations, no more careful records. The 600-year program ends. Why? The political explanation: Greek conquest disrupted temple institutions, traditional funding ceased, the programs couldn't be sustained. But Greek rulers often respected local religious traditions, provided funding for temples they found useful. If astronomical observation were merely cultural tradition, Greeks might have continued supporting it. That they didn't suggest the programs had lost relevance. Either the monitoring was no longer necessary, or those requiring monitoring had ceased paying attention, or the systems the observations fed into had been decommissioned. The timing coincides with broader changes. Traditional Mesopotamian religion was gradually replaced by Hellenistic culture. Temple institutions declined, priestly knowledge transmission fractured, ancient traditions were abandoned or forgotten. If astronomical observation programs were connected to Anunnaki monitoring systems, and if those systems had been withdrawn or deactivated, the observational programs would lose their functional purpose. They'd become empty ritual, performed by rote without understanding, eventually abandoned when institutional continuity broke down. The star maps remain. The tablets survive in museums. The knowledge they contain can be read, analysed, appreciated, but the systems they served no longer function, or function without human participation. The sky still moves according to laws the Mesopotamians charted so carefully. The positions they predicted still occur. The correlations they noted between celestial and earthly events might still hold. But no one watches anymore. No one observes according to the protocols those tablets prescribed. No one feeds data into monitoring systems built 5,000 years ago, unless someone does. Unless observation continues through means we don't recognize. Unless the infrastructure they built, temples aligned for astronomical observation, sightlines calibrated to celestial events, foundations positioned over aquifers, networks connecting distributed sites, still functions, still monitors, still watches through architecture and alignment, and systems humans built, but perhaps no longer operate. The star maps remain, in clay, permanent, preserved, instructions for monitoring systems, guides for observers, protocols for watching the sky and recognizing when the gods communicate through celestial signs. Humanity fulfilled that role for 6 centuries, then stopped. Whether the monitoring itself stopped, or merely human participation in it, remains an open question. Structures that outlast empires. The ziggurat at Ur was reconstructed in the 1980s by the Iraqi government based on archaeological evidence from Leonard Woolley's 1920s excavations. What stands now is partial reconstruction, 3 platforms rising approximately 60 feet, replicating the base of a structure originally much taller. But even this fragment demonstrates something remarkable. 2,000 years after the original construction, after millennia of abandonment, decay and wind erosion, the builders could still identify the exact foundation plan. The corners remained aligned to cardinal directions. The orientation was preserved despite destruction and time. This happens repeatedly across Mesopotamia. Temples destroyed by war, flood, or simple deterioration are rebuilt precisely where they stood oriented exactly as before, following architectural plans that somehow survived the destruction itself. The continuity isn't approximate, it's exact. Foundation deposits from earlier structures are excavated, read, and used to guide reconstruction. Measurements are preserved in tablets that survive when buildings don't. The knowledge of where things stood and how they were aligned persists across gaps of destruction that should have erased institutional memory. Consider Babylon. The city was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across its 3,000-year history. Hammurabi constructed monumental buildings around 1750 BC. Assyrian conquest in 689 BC devastated the city. Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt it around 600 BC, creating the Babylon of legend with its famous gates and ziggurat. Alexander's conquest in 331 BC initiated Greek influence. Parthian and Sassanid rule followed. Each period brought architectural changes, but the core layout persisted. The Esagila Temple of Marduk remained where it had always been. The ziggurat at Temenanki, though rebuilt multiple times, stood on the same foundations. The sacred precinct's orientation never changed. How is this possible? Modern urban planning uses detailed maps, surveying equipment, legal property records, and digital archives. When reconstruction occurs after disaster, we consult these records to determine previous layouts. Ancient Mesopotamia lacked most such tools. They had no paper maps that would survive storage for centuries. Surveying equipment was primitive. Legal records existed, but were vulnerable. Clay tablets can burn, buildings can collapse, yet somehow the information persisted. The answer lies in the structures themselves. Foundation deposits marked coordinates. Inscribed objects buried at corners, beneath walls, under doorways, recorded dimensions, orientations, and positions. The deposits were permanent markers, readable after excavating ruins. Later builders could literally dig up the specifications, read them, and rebuild accordingly. The architecture was self-documenting. But this requires astonishing continuity of knowledge. Excavating foundations accurately without modern equipment demands understanding of where to dig. Reading cuneiform requires literacy transmitted across generations. Following ancient building specifications requires trusting that those specifications remain valid, that the precise orientations and positions matter enough to justify expense of exact replication. All of this happened for thousands of years, across dozens of cities, through invasions, dynasties, cultural changes that replaced languages, gods, and political systems. The temple structures persisted. Why? The religious answer, sacred sites remain sacred, tradition demands preservation. But not all traditions persist for millennia. Most religious practices evolve, adapt, eventually transform into something unrecognizable. Mesopotamian temple architecture showed remarkable conservatism. The same designs, same orientations, same location selection criteria applied across 3,000 years. That's not normal religious evolution, that's system maintenance. If temples served functions beyond worship, if they were monitoring infrastructure, communication nodes, interfaces to networks the Anunnaki established, then maintaining them precisely becomes critical. You can't relocate a network node without reconfiguring all connections. You can't reorient an astronomical observation station without recalculating all sightlines. You can't move structures built over specific aquifer features without losing access to those features. Precise restoration isn't religious devotion, it's technical necessity. The structures themselves embody this necessity. Foundations reaching to bedrock or water table, astronomical alignments requiring specific geographic locations, networks of temples positioned for coverage of regions. Each element depends on position, orientation, and connectivity. Lose any of these, and functionality degrades. The Mesopotamians understood this. They preserved positions with obsessive care because position mattered for reasons beyond sanctity. There's archaeological evidence for systematic site planning. Survey texts survive describing distances between cities, orientations of structures, relationships between different temple complexes. The measurements are precise, not rounded estimates, but specific counts in cubits, fingers, grain widths. Someone mapped Mesopotamia, created comprehensive spatial documentation, preserved it carefully enough that even after major destructions, rebuilding could follow original plans. Who conducted these surveys? Temple priests possessed the necessary skills. They trained in mathematics, astronomy, and land measurement. They maintained archives. Their positions were hereditary, ensuring knowledge transmission across generations. But the surveys themselves, the comprehensive mapping of regions, the precise positioning of temples relative to each other, suggest coordination beyond individual cities. Someone planned the overall network, selected where major temples would be positioned, ensured optimal coverage for whatever purposes the network served. The texts attribute this planning to gods. Enki established Eridu, Enlil selected Nippur, Anu claimed Uruk. Each city received its patron deity, who determined where temples would be built, how they'd be oriented, what functions they'd serve. This sounds like mythology until you recognize that it describes distributed network design by central planners. Different nodes serve different functions, but all coordinate according to overall architecture determined by system designers. If the Anunnaki designed this system, they needed human participation for implementation and maintenance. Humans provided labour, conducted observations, maintained archives, performed rituals. But humans don't naturally maintain precise architectural standards across millennia. That level of conservatism requires either external pressure, gods enforcing compliance, or demonstrable functionality, systems that work only if maintained precisely. Perhaps both operated. The gods demanded precise reconstruction because systems required it. Deviate from specifications and things stopped working. Temples improperly oriented didn't function as communication interfaces. Structures built away from designated positions couldn't access aquifer networks. The feedback was immediate enough that humans learned compliance. And institutional memory preserved the lesson, build it exactly as before, or it won't work. This functionality enforcement would appear in texts as divine punishment for improper construction. We do have such texts, temples built incorrectly that fail to attract divine favour, rulers who modify sacred architecture and suffer misfortune, structures that must be torn down and rebuilt properly because they displease the gods. If we read these accounts functionally rather than theologically, they describe system failures. Construction errors produced non-functional interfaces. The errors had to be corrected. Over time, this trial and error refinement produced extremely specific building protocols. Do it this way, at this position, with this orientation, or it doesn't work. The protocols were preserved in foundation deposits, temple archives, priestly training. They became tradition, sacred law beyond question. But the origin was practical. These specifications produced functional structures. The structures outlasted empires precisely because they served functions that transcended political authority. Kings rose and fell. Dynasties replaced dynasties. Invaders conquered and were conquered in turn. But the temple networks persisted, maintaining functions that all those political changes depended upon. Communication systems, monitoring infrastructure, administrative frameworks. The temples provided services that made governance possible, so every conqueror preserved them, funded them, honoured the gods they housed. This explains otherwise puzzling archaeological patterns. Conquered cities often show destruction layers, burned buildings, smashed fortifications, clear evidence of military devastation. But temple precincts within those cities show continuity. The temples survived conquest or were reconstructed quickly. The sacred precincts remained intact while residential districts were razed. Why spare temples if your goal is total conquest? Because you need them, because your own governance will require the systems those temples interface with, because destroying them would be destroying infrastructure you'll need to access. Conquerors learnt this. The smart ones preserved temples even while destroying everything else. The ones who didn't suffer administrative difficulties until they realised their mistake and rebuilt what they'd destroyed. The structures were built to outlast empires, designed for it, positioned on foundations that reached bedrock, ensuring seismic stability, oriented to celestial coordinates that remain constant despite political changes, documented with foundation deposits that survive structural destruction, connected to natural systems, aquifers, fault lines, geographic features that exist independently of human presence. The architecture was robust by design, intentionally engineered to persist. And it has persisted. 5,000 years later, we can still identify where the White Temple at Uruk stood, still measure the alignment of the ziggurat at Ur, still excavate the 18 superimposed temples at Eridu. The structures are ruins, but the ruins preserve information. The positions remain, the orientations remain, the foundation deposits remain, buried precisely where ancient builders placed them, marking coordinates that mattered then and might matter still. If monitoring systems were built into Mesopotamian temple architecture, if the Anunnaki established infrastructure designed to outlast human civilizations, to persist across millennia, to require only basic maintenance to remain functional, then what we observe is exactly what we'd expect. Structures that survive empires, positions preserved across catastrophes, architectural conservatism enforced by functional requirements, and slow degradation over centuries as maintenance decreases, understanding fades, but the basic infrastructure endures because it was built to endure. The ziggurats still rise from desert sand, eroded, reconstructed, fragmentary, but positioned where they were always positioned, aligned as they were always aligned. The stones don't remember who built them or why, but they remain where they were placed, marking coordinates, maintaining orientations, sitting atop aquifers and geographic features that gave those positions significance. Someone built infrastructure to outlast empires. Someone succeeded. Whether that infrastructure still serves its original purposes or sits abandoned, functional but unmaintained, remains uncertain. But it's there, still there, after all these millennia, still precisely where it was built, still waiting for someone to recognize what it is, what surveillance might look like. We've catalogued the evidence. 18 temple levels at Eridu spanning millennia, each built exactly atop its predecessor. The White Temple at Uruk, corners aligned to cardinal directions within half a degree. The Gudea cylinders describing architectural specifications received in dreams. Ziggurat orientations tracking solstices and star rising points. Foundation deposits marking positions with inscribed metal objects driven into bedrock. The Iabzu temple built over underground waters. 600 Anunnaki divided between heaven and earth. The Me as transferable capabilities. Nippur's 3,000-year sanctity despite no strategic value. Kingless recording impossibly long antediluvian reigns. 6 centuries of nightly astronomical observations. Structures rebuilt precisely after destruction across millennia. Each element, examined alone, admits conventional explanation, religious devotion, political legitimation, astronomical skill, architectural tradition. But the pattern, the consistent, precise technical pattern spanning 3,000 years, suggests something more. Not proof of anything. Evidence never proves. But evidence suggests. It implies. It asks whether conventional explanations adequately account for what we observe. What if we hypothesize surveillance? Not in the modern sense of cameras and electronics, but in the ancient sense of distributed observation infrastructure. What would we expect to find? What capabilities would such a system require? How would it manifest in archaeology? First requirement, geographic coverage. You can't monitor a region from a single point. You need distributed observation stations positioned for comprehensive coverage. Mesopotamia shows exactly this. Dozens of major temple sites distributed across the alluvial plain from Persian Gulf to northern uplands. The spacing isn't random. Major sites cluster where population centres existed, but smaller temples fill gaps, creating network density. Someone surveyed the region, identified optimal positions, established stations accordingly. Second requirement, longevity. Surveillance infrastructure must persist across the timescales you're monitoring. Temporary installations provide temporary data. If you're monitoring civilization development across millennia, your infrastructure must endure millennia. Mesopotamian temples demonstrate this longevity, continuous occupation from 5000 BCE to classical period, consistent rebuilding on exact locations, institutional frameworks ensuring knowledge transmission across generations. The system persisted longer than any single civilization within it. Third requirement, astronomical capability. Monitoring Earth from above requires tracking position and time. Astronomical observations provide both. Celestial coordinates enable spatial positioning. Stellar, solar/lunar cycles enable temporal calibration. Mesopotamian temples performed sophisticated astronomy, systematic observation programs, accurate prediction of celestial events, mathematical models of planetary motion. The capabilities match what distributed monitoring network would require: precise time measurement, position verification, celestial event tracking. Fourth requirement, communication systems. Distributed stations must transmit data to processing centers. Ancient technology lacked electronics, but natural systems could serve. Aquifer networks span regions, connecting distant locations through underground water. The text described the Abzu as domain of Enki, who perceives all that occurs, who dwells in the depths, whose temple at Eridu connects surface to underground waters. If water systems served communication functions, temples positioned over aquifers would have network access. Iabzu at Eridu, Ekur at Nippur, multiple sites described as having foundations reaching to underground waters. Fifth requirement, precise positioning. Network nodes must occupy specific coordinates. You can't relocate a GPS satellite randomly without breaking the system. Similarly, if temples served as monitoring stations, their positions would be critical. The evidence shows obsessive position preservation, exact rebuilding on previous foundations, foundation deposits marking coordinates, survey texts documenting intersite distances, astronomical alignments requiring specific latitudes. The positioning was precise because positioning mattered functionally. Sixth requirement, standardization. Network components must follow compatible specifications. Mesopotamian temple architecture shows remarkable standardization, ziggurat design appearing across sites and periods, astronomical alignments following consistent patterns, foundation deposit practices uniform across cities, cuneiform record keeping enabling information exchange. The standardization suggests system integration. Individual temples weren't isolated religious structures, they were nodes in coordinated network. Seventh requirement, maintenance protocols. Infrastructure requires upkeep across generations. Mesopotamian temples had institutional frameworks for this: hereditary priesthoods, temple endowments funding operations, training programs for astronomical observers and ritual specialists, archives preserving construction specifications. The system was designed for long-term maintenance by human operators who might not fully understand what they maintained, but could follow procedures ensuring system continuity. Eighth requirement, data collection. Surveillance requires systematic observation and documentation. Mesopotamian temples performed exactly this. Astronomical observations recorded nightly for centuries, economic transactions documented in temple archives, population movements tracked, weather patterns noted, omen texts capturing correlations between celestial and earthly events. The data collection was comprehensive, systematic, long-term, characteristics of organized monitoring program. Ninth requirement, hierarchical structure. Networks require central processing nodes and distributed sensors. Mesopotamian temple hierarchy shows this structure, major centres like Nippur and Babylon accumulating information from regional sites, astronomical observations from multiple cities compiled at central temples, king lists maintained at administrative hubs tracking dynastic changes across territories. The hierarchy enabled data flow from distributed collection points to central analysis centres. 10th requirement: power source. Infrastructure needs energy. Ancient structures couldn't use electricity, but they could exploit natural phenomena. Lightning strikes tall structures. Ziggurats were tallest buildings in regions prone to thunderstorms. Foundation pegs driven into ground create grounding systems. Aquifers and underground water flow generate subtle electrical potentials. Temple positions over seismically active regions access geothermal energy. Whether the Mesopotamians deliberately exploited these power sources is speculative, but the infrastructure they built would incidentally access them. Each requirement finds correspondence in archaeological evidence. Not perfect match, we're mapping ancient infrastructure onto modern concepts of surveillance systems. But the functional capabilities align. If you designed surveillance network with Bronze Age technology, utilizing natural systems and human labor, architected to persist millennia, you'd build something remarkably similar to what existed in ancient Mesopotamia. The system would be passive once established. No visible activity indicating ongoing monitoring. Temples would appear as religious structures because religious frameworks provided cultural support for maintenance. Human operators would perform rituals that functioned as system operations without understanding technical purposes. The infrastructure would blend into landscape, unremarkable to anyone not recognizing its functional design. And monitoring could continue indefinitely, requiring only minimal active intervention as long as humans maintained basic infrastructure according to transmitted specifications. What would such system monitor? Population movements, economic development, technological innovation, social organization, political changes, all the factors indicating civilization's development trajectory. Not immediate tactical surveillance, not monitoring individuals, but strategic observation. How is this species developing? Are they following expected patterns? Do interventions remain necessary, or have they achieved sufficient independence? The Sumerian texts describe exactly such monitoring. The gods watch over humanity. They observe from temples. They take interest in human affairs. They intervene when necessary, sending floods, altering fates, adjusting divine favour. But increasingly they withdraw. After the flood, divine presence becomes less direct. Humans manage more independently. The monitoring continues. The texts never suggest gods stop watching, but active intervention decreases. That matches the pattern we'd expect if a more advanced civilization seeded technology, established infrastructure, trained local populations in system maintenance, then gradually withdrew direct presence while maintaining observation capability. The monitoring systems remain functional. The infrastructure persists. Data collection continues. But the monitored population increasingly operates independently, unaware that observation continues or misinterpreting it as supernatural rather than technological. 5,000 years later, what remains? The structures, positioned precisely, aligned astronomically, built over aquifers, connected through geography and mathematics into networks we're only beginning to map systematically. The foundation deposits, still buried, still marking coordinates. The astronomical alignments, still accurate despite precession. The aquifer systems, still flowing beneath temple foundations. The positions themselves, still identifiable through archaeology. Whether any of this infrastructure remains functional is unanswerable. We don't know what functionality would look like. We stopped maintaining the systems millennia ago. Rituals ceased, observations ended, temples were abandoned. If monitoring systems were embedded in this infrastructure, they would either have degraded below operational capability or continue functioning without human participation. The latter possibility is uncomfortable. It suggests we're still being observed through infrastructure we no longer understand, built into temples we treat as historical ruins, maintained by processes we can't detect. The idea sounds paranoid, but the evidence suggests someone built sophisticated monitoring infrastructure that has persisted 5,000 years with minimal maintenance. If it was engineered well, if the Anunnaki were as advanced as the text's technological descriptions suggest, there's no reason such systems couldn't remain functional far longer. We've sent space probes designed to function for decades without maintenance. We've built satellites expected to operate autonomously for years. The idea that sufficiently advanced civilization could build infrastructure functioning for millennia isn't science fiction. It's engineering scaled to longer timescales than we typically consider. And the Mesopotamian infrastructure was scaled for exactly such timescales. Built during a period when humans believed in their own immortality through divine contact, designed by beings the texts describe as essentially immortal, intended to persist across epochs measured in thousands of years. If the Anunnaki are observing humanity through undetected ancient structures, the structures are detected. We've excavated them, measured them, catalogued them. What remains undetected is their function. If that function extends beyond religious purposes, we've assumed. The temples stand, the alignments hold, the foundations rest where they were laid, and somewhere, perhaps, data still flows through systems built when writing was new and cities were young. We can't prove this. Evidence doesn't prove. But the infrastructure exists. The capabilities exist. The patterns exist. Everything required for surveillance system built 5,000 years ago, maintained through religious frameworks, designed to outlast civilizations, it's all present in archaeological record. The only question is whether it was intentional. The texts say it was. The gods watch over humanity. They observe from heaven and earth. They maintain awareness through temples that function as their houses, their observation posts, their interfaces with the world they once governed directly. We can read those texts as mythology, or we can read them as description. Either way, the structures remain silent, aligned, positioned, still there after all these millennia, still precisely where they were built, still oriented as they were designed, still resting over waters called Abzu, still marking coordinates someone deemed important enough to preserve across the entire span of recorded human history, still waiting, still watching, or simply still standing, empty monuments to religious beliefs we've outgrown, archaeological sites we catalogue and study and never quite understand. The difference matters, but perhaps not to the structures themselves. They fulfill their purpose simply by remaining, by marking, by aligning, by existing exactly where they've always been, doing whatever it is they do, whether anyone watches through them or not. The Anunnaki might be gone, the systems might be dormant, the infrastructure might be nothing more than ruins, but it's still there, all of it. Every aligned ziggurat, every foundation deposit, every temple built and rebuilt in the same position for 3,000 years, still there, still precisely positioned, still capable of exactly what it was built to do whenever someone decides to use it. The silent architecture. The sand is cool at this hour. Dawn has not yet broken over the Iraqi desert, and the stars, those same stars the Mesopotamians mapped so carefully on clay tablets 5,000 years ago, are still visible, wheeling slowly overhead according to mechanics that ancient astronomers tracked with startling precision. You're standing at the base of the reconstructed ziggurat at Ur, and the silence is absolute. No wind, no distant traffic, just stillness and the faint smell of dust and ancient brick. This is what remains, stones and silence. The ziggurat rises in 3 massive platforms, each smaller than the one below, creating that distinctive stepped profile that defined sacred architecture across this region for 3 millennia. The corners point to cardinal directions, true north, south, east, west, aligned as precisely now as when first constructed 4,000 years ago. From the uppermost platform, approximately 60 feet above the desert floor, you could watch sunrise on any morning of the year and track its position shifting along the horizon across seasons, just as ancient astronomers did, recording data that accumulated into comprehensive models of celestial mechanics. The structure speaks of permanence, of intention, of purposes that outlasted every empire that claimed dominion over this land. The Ziggurat-Ur survived Sumerian civilization, survived Akkadian conquest, survived Babylonian rule, survived Persian administration, survived Islamic expansion, survived centuries of abandonment. It survives still, silent testimony to builders who constructed for timescales beyond their own lifetimes, beyond their culture's duration, perhaps beyond their species' memory. We've examined evidence across 14 chapters, 18 temple levels at Eridu, astronomical alignments requiring mathematical sophistication, dreams describing architectural specifications, foundation deposits marking coordinates, the Abzu beneath, domain of Enki, connecting temples through underground waters, 600 Anunnaki divided between heaven and earth, the Me as transferable powers enabling civilization, Nippur's 3,000-year sanctity, king lists recording pre-flood rains, 6 centuries of nightly sky observation, structures rebuilt precisely across millennia. The pattern suggested surveillance infrastructure, distributed observation stations, astronomical capability, communication through natural systems, precise positioning, standardization across sites, institutional maintenance protocols, systematic data collection, hierarchical organization, longevity measured in millennia. Everything required for monitoring system built with Bronze Age technology and engineered to persist far longer than the civilization that constructed it. But pattern isn't proof. Evidence suggests. It doesn't demonstrate. We can't know whether Mesopotamian temples served monitoring functions. We can't determine if the Anunnaki, whatever they were, whoever they were, established observation networks that persist today. We can't prove surveillance through architecture built 5,000 years ago. What we can say is this: someone built extraordinary infrastructure. They positioned it precisely, aligned it astronomically, connected it systematically, and maintained it obsessively across 3,000 years despite political upheaval, cultural transformation, and civilizational collapse. They describe this work as service to gods who watched over humanity, gods who dwelt in temples positioned at bonds between heaven and earth, gods who observed through structures humans built according to divine specifications. The descriptions are consistent, the specifications are precise, the construction is sophisticated, the persistence is remarkable, and the purposes, beyond religious worship, remain incompletely explained by conventional archaeology. That's the mystery. Not whether aliens built the pyramids. Humans clearly built Mesopotamian temples, but whether humans built them alone, whether the specifications they followed were their own invention or instruction received from beings possessing more advanced understanding, whether the infrastructure they maintained so carefully served only religious purposes or also functioned as monitoring systems for observers whose presence has become less visible but whose interest might persist. The texts insist the latter. The Anunnaki established civilization. They taught astronomy, mathematics, writing, architecture. They established temples and designated cities. They organized humanity according to administrative frameworks they controlled. Then, gradually, they withdrew direct presence. But withdrawal isn't disappearance. Remote monitoring is not absence. An infrastructure designed to outlast empires doesn't cease functioning simply because immediate operators no longer understand what they're operating. We've stopped operating it. The astronomical observations ended in the 2nd century BC. The ritual maintenance gradually ceased. The temples were abandoned, became ruins, were excavated as archaeological sites. We catalogue them now, study them, debate their meanings, but we don't use them. Whatever functionality they possessed, religious, astronomical, or monitoring, we've discontinued. Yet the functionality doesn't depend on our participation. The astronomical alignments still function, sunrise still occurs at predicted positions, solstices still happen at proper dates, stars still rise at calculated times. The foundations still rest over aquifers. Underground water still flows through limestone cavities beneath Eridu, beneath Nipper, beneath all those carefully selected positions. The cardinal direction alignments still hold. True north remains where ancient builders oriented their structures. The network still exists. Temple positions still define geometric relationships across Mesopotamian landscape. If monitoring systems were embedded in this infrastructure, if observation could occur through astronomical alignments and aquifer connections and precisely positioned foundations, those systems would function whether or not we maintain them. They would operate passively, requiring only that the architecture remain in place. And the architecture does remain fragmentary, ruined, but positioned correctly, oriented accurately, still connected to natural systems that gave those positions significance. The Anunnaki, if they observe, if they establish these systems, if awareness continues, they would see what humanity has become. Not gods ruling directly, not beings dwelling in temples and issuing decrees, but watchers, observers maintaining awareness through infrastructure built when our civilizations were young, tracking our development across millennia, our progress, our conflicts, our slow evolution toward whatever future we're building. That possibility is unsettling. The idea that we might be observed through mechanisms we don't recognize, through ruins we treat as historical sites, through architecture we've studied but perhaps never fully understood. It suggests our development isn't as independent as we believe, that watchers remain, that the divine awareness ancient people described might be ongoing reality, just operating through means we've reclassified as archaeological remnants because we've decided that advancement means outgrowing belief in gods. But gods are vocabulary, terms used by less technologically advanced cultures to describe beings with greater knowledge, greater capabilities, greater reach. If such beings existed, if they established early civilizations, transmitted knowledge to our ancestors, built infrastructure that persists today, calling them gods doesn't make them supernatural. It acknowledges their position relative to ours, their capabilities beyond our understanding at the time of contact. The silence surrounding these structures feels weighty, like the pressure of time itself, of permanence, of all those centuries when humans climbed temple steps to perform rituals they believed connected them to divine observers. Were they mistaken? Was it empty ceremony, performed for psychological comfort, signifying nothing beyond human need for cosmic meaning? Or were they accurate? Were those rituals operational procedures performed according to specifications that maintained systems their civilization depended on? Were the gods they served actual beings who monitored, who observed through architecture designed for exactly that purpose? Were prayers actually transmissions, sent through systems embedded in foundations, received by listeners who remained engaged, but increasingly distant as humanity developed capacity for greater independence? We cannot know with certainty. The evidence permits multiple interpretations. Conventional scholarship explains everything through religious belief and human cultural evolution. Alternative frameworks suggest technological infrastructure and advanced intervention. Both models account for observable data. Neither can be definitively proven from stones and tablets alone. What remains is uncertainty, questions that archaeology raises but cannot conclusively answer, and structures that stand silent across landscapes, revealing little, explaining nothing, simply persisting as they've persisted for 5 millennia, aligned, positioned, connected to earth and sky through careful engineering, still capable of whatever functions they were designed to perform. Consider what we've inherited. Not just ruins, but positions. Coordinates marked with such precision that we can still identify them after thousands of years. Alignments calibrated so carefully that they remain accurate despite Earth's axial precession. Foundation deposits that record specifications in permanent form, buried where they'll survive the structures themselves. Knowledge encoded in tablets, astronomical tables, mathematical procedures, architectural specifications, ritual protocols, all of it suggesting that someone wanted this information preserved beyond the lifetime of any single civilization. The Gudea cylinders record building instructions received in dreams. The Sumerian king list preserves memory of rulers before the flood. The mole.apian tablets document centuries of astronomical observation. Foundation deposits mark coordinates with inscribed metal objects. The temples themselves, rebuilt precisely after destruction, demonstrate that position mattered more than convenience, more than politics, more than anything except functionality. Functionality for what purpose? That question echoes across empty plazas, where ziggurats once rose 9 stories high, where priests climbed steep stairs to reach platforms designed for unobstructed sky views. It echoes through excavated foundation trenches that reach down to aquifers, through chambers described as connecting to the Abzu below. It echoes in the persistent sanctity of Nippur, honoured by every conqueror for 3,000 years, despite offering no strategic advantage. The texts answer, the gods watch. They observe from their positions between heaven and earth. They maintain awareness through temples that function as their houses, their vantage points, their interfaces with the world they once governed more directly. The Anunnaki were assigned to Earth, 300 of them, and those assignments required infrastructure, stations from which to monitor, systems for collecting information, networks for communication, and humans trained in proper procedures, maintaining everything according to specifications established before recorded history begins. We can dismiss this as mythology, ancient people inventing divine explanations for cultural practices they didn't understand. But the alternative, that the texts describe actual systems, actual infrastructure, actual monitoring by beings we called gods because we lacked better vocabulary, explains more of what we observe. The precision, the persistence, the consistency across millennia, the obsessive maintenance of positions and alignments, the astronomical sophistication appearing suddenly and remaining stable, the network characteristics of temple distribution. If you were designing long-term observation infrastructure with Bronze Age technology, you would build something very similar to what existed in ancient Mesopotamia. Distributed stations providing coverage, astronomical alignment for calibration, natural systems providing communication pathways, precise positioning over geologically significant features, standardized construction enabling network integration, religious frameworks ensuring human maintenance across generations, and documentation systems, foundation deposits, cuneiform archives, ritual procedures, preserving specifications indefinitely. The system would be elegant in its simplicity. Once established, it requires minimal active intervention. Humans maintain the physical structures and perform operational procedures they understand as religious rituals. The infrastructure persists through cultural changes because its maintenance is embedded in religious obligation. An observation continues passively, requiring only that the architecture remain in place, that the alignments hold, that the positions be preserved. 5,000 years later, most of that infrastructure still exists. Fragmentary, certainly, degraded by time and abandonment, but the foundations remain. The positions are documented. the alignments can still be measured, and the natural systems those structures interfaced with, the aquifers, the celestial mechanics, the geographic coordinates, continue functioning exactly as they did when the first temple was built at Eridu in 5400 BCE. Whether anything still observes through this ancient infrastructure is unanswerable. We lack the knowledge to detect such observation. We don't know what monitoring would look like operating through systems designed 5 millennia ago. We've stopped participating in the maintenance protocols, so we wouldn't recognise if our discontinuation affected system operations or if those operations continue independently. But the capability was built in. The infrastructure was designed for persistence. The alignments were calibrated for precision. The positions were selected for properties that transcended immediate human purposes. Someone engineered systems meant to endure far longer than the civilization that constructed them, to function with or without active human operation, to maintain capability across timescales measured in tens of thousands of years. That ambition, that scope of vision, speaks to purposes beyond what we typically associate with Bronze Age cultures. It suggests planning by beings thinking in terms of civilizational development across deep time. Beings who could afford patience measured in millennia. Beings who established infrastructure, seeded knowledge, trained human operators, and then withdrew to observe what would develop when their direct influence decreased. The withdrawal itself is documented. The texts describe it. After the flood, divine presence becomes less direct. The gods are still acknowledged, still worshipped, still believed to observe, and occasionally intervene. But the constant interaction of the antediluvian period has ended. Humans manage civilization increasingly independently. The transition is portrayed as deliberate, a planned reduction in direct governance, allowing humanity to develop autonomously while maintaining oversight through the infrastructure that remains. If this reading is accurate, we're living in the post-withdrawal period, managing civilization without constant instruction, operating according to principles established long ago but now evolved beyond their origin, observed perhaps but not controlled, monitored but not managed. The ancient infrastructure still positions its silent stations across the landscape, still aligned, still potentially functional, but we're no longer trained to operate them consciously. We don't perform the rituals. We don't make the observations. We've moved on. Yet the structures persist. The ziggurat at Ur, the foundations at Eridu, the sacred precinct at Nippur, scattered across Iraq and neighbouring regions, marking positions someone deemed important enough to preserve across every catastrophe, every conquest, every transformation that 5,000 years of history delivered. They're monuments now, archaeological sites, tourist destinations where visitors marvel at ancient engineering and ancient beliefs. But monuments don't require precision. Tourist sites don't need astronomical alignments calibrated to fractions of a degree. Archaeological remains don't demand positions maintained across 3,000 years despite easy alternatives. The care invested in these structures suggests purposes beyond commemoration, functional purposes, purposes that required exactitude and permanence and network integration. The sun rises now over the Iraqi desert. Light touches the uppermost platform of the ziggurat at Ur, exactly as ancient astronomers calculated it would, casting shadows that track across stone surfaces according to mechanics mapped on clay tablets now housed in museum collections thousands of miles away. The cycle continues, Earth rotating, sun appearing to move, celestial mechanics operating precisely as the Babylonians predicted, as the Sumerians observed, as the gods supposedly taught humanity to track when civilization was new. And somewhere in that sunrise, in that perfect alignment of architecture and astronomy, in that continuation of cycles charted 5,000 years ago, somewhere in all of that is the question we inherit. Are we alone in observing this sunrise? Or does it reach other eyes as well, looking through sight lines established when our ancestors first learned to write? through infrastructure built to outlast empires, through systems designed for observation across timescales that dwarf individual human lives. The question remains open. The evidence remains ambiguous. The structures remain positioned, aligned, connected to earth and sky through engineering we've documented, but perhaps never fully comprehended. Whether the Anunnaki are observing humanity through undetected ancient structures depends on what we mean by undetected. The structures are detected. We've excavated them, measured them, catalogued them. What remains undetected, if it exists, is their continued functionality, whether the precise alignments still serve purposes beyond historical interest, whether the foundation positions still interface with systems we don't recognize. Whether the network still operates, collecting data through means we've reclassified as archaeological artifacts, because we cannot imagine how stones and water and astronomical alignments could function as observation infrastructure. But imagination is not evidence. Ancient peoples imagined the gods watched over them, and they built accordingly. They constructed with precision we find remarkable, maintained with obsessiveness we find puzzling, preserved with determination we struggle to explain. They left us structures that pose questions archaeology alone cannot answer. Perhaps those structures are exactly what conventional scholarship suggests: religious buildings, impressive in their execution, but ultimately serving only cultural and spiritual functions, empty now except for history. Or perhaps they're what the texts describe: houses of gods, bonds between heaven and earth, observation posts where divine beings maintained awareness of human development. Silent now, waiting, watching still, perhaps, through alignments that hold despite our abandonment, through connections to natural systems that persist regardless of human participation. We stand in the dawn light, surrounded by ruins that might be monuments or might be machinery, looking up at stones arranged with extraordinary care for purposes we debate but cannot prove, inheriting questions from ancestors who claim they built these structures according to divine instruction for divine purposes, maintaining divine presence in a world the gods governed from precise positions marked by temples that would outlast any empire. The silence offers no answers. The stones remain mute. The foundations buried beneath sand reveal their specifications only through excavation, and even then tell us how they were built, not why those specific specifications mattered. The astronomical alignments function perfectly, but functioning is not purpose. The aquifers flow beneath ancient temple positions, but water is not evidence of communication systems we cannot detect. What we have is pattern, consistent, precise, technically sophisticated pattern maintained across 3,000 years. And texts explaining that pattern, the gods established civilization, provided knowledge, built through human hands, and watched still through structures designed to outlast human memory of their origin. We can believe those texts or dismiss them, accept them as description, or categorize them as mythology. The choice remains individual. But the structures themselves are undeniable. They exist. They persist. They hold their alignments and preserve their positions and maintain their connections to earth and sky. And as dawn fully breaks over the Mesopotamian desert, as light floods the ancient landscape where civilization supposedly began, where writing was invented and cities first rose and gods walked among humans, in that light, the question remains suspended, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Are we alone? Or do we remain observed through infrastructure so ancient we've forgotten what it is, so precisely engineered we cannot imagine how it functions, so elegantly designed it requires no maintenance to persist across millennia? The temples stand silent, the foundations rest undisturbed, the alignments hold their calibration, and somewhere, in heaven, in the depths, in realms the texts describe but we cannot locate, perhaps the watchers remain, patient, observing, waiting for whatever comes next in the development of a species they seeded with knowledge, organised into civilization, and released to manage its own evolution. Or perhaps there's no one there. Perhaps we truly are alone, managing ourselves, developing independently. The temples merely ruins, the gods merely myths, the precision merely human achievement we should credit to our ancestors rather than attributing to instruction from above. Either way, the structures remain, positioned, aligned, silent, marking coordinates across the landscape where civilization began, where humanity first learned to write its questions in permanent form, where gods supposedly taught and watched and eventually withdrew. The questions remain as well, inscribed not in clay, but in the very structure of our history, embedded in the foundations of civilization, asking whether we've ever truly been alone, whether we remain observed, whether the silence surrounding these ancient structures is the absence of watchers, or simply the quietness of observation that requires no announcement. The sunrise completes, the shadows shift, the day begins, and the temples, those silent, aligned, precisely positioned markers, continue standing exactly where they've stood for 5,000 years, waiting for nothing, perhaps, or waiting for everything, until we possess the understanding to recognize what they are, what they've always been, what they might remain, houses of gods, or instruments of observation, or both, or neither. The architecture offers no answer. It simply persists, silent, monumental, precisely aligned to coordinates that matter for reasons we debate but cannot prove. Still there after all these millennia, still positioned exactly where someone long ago deemed those positions necessary, still watching perhaps, or simply still standing. The difference matters enormously, but perhaps not to the structures themselves. They fulfill their purpose simply by remaining, by marking, by aligning, by existing exactly where they were built, maintaining exactly what they were designed to maintain, whether anyone watches through them or not. The Anunnaki might be observing still. The systems might remain functional. The infrastructure might continue performing exactly as designed. Monitoring through means we don't recognize. Through architecture we've studied for over a century without fully understanding. Or the watchers might have departed entirely. The systems might be dormant. The infrastructure might be empty shells, impressive in their engineering, but hollow in their purpose, monuments to beliefs we've outgrown and technologies we never possessed. We cannot know. We can only observe what remains, the stones, the alignments, the positions, and wonder. The wondering itself is perhaps the final gift. Not certainty, but the question. Not answers, but the recognition that answers might exist beyond our current understanding. Not proof, but the awareness that what we dismiss as impossible might simply be improbable given what we know. The temples stand. The questions remain. And somewhere between the stones and the silence, between the documented precision and the undocumented purposes, between what archaeology proves and what texts describe, lies the possibility that has haunted human consciousness since writing began, that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the watchers remain. Observing through means we've forgotten how to recognize. Maintaining awareness through infrastructure we maintain as tourists rather than operators. It's uncomfortable, unsettling. The idea that our development unfolds under observation we cannot confirm or deny, but it's also curiously reassuring. The notion that someone cared enough to watch, to establish systems ensuring observation would persist, to build infrastructure outlasting empires, designed to remain functional across timescales that dwarf our individual existence or civilizational memory. Whether the Anunnaki are observing humanity through undetected ancient structures is ultimately less important than the recognition that such observation was designed for, that someone engineered systems for exactly that purpose, that the capability was built, was maintained, persists potentially still in structures we walk past without understanding their sophistication. The temples remain. The alignments hold. The foundations rest where they were laid, connected to aquifers below and constellations above, marking positions that meant something to builders who devoted extraordinary resources to getting them exactly right. And in the growing light of morning, in the lengthening shadows cast by stones positioned 5,000 years ago, in the absolute silence that surrounds ruins once filled with ritual and purpose, in all of that, the question persists. Are we still being watched? The temples offer no answer. They simply stand, precisely positioned, carefully aligned, deeply founded, connected to earth and sky through engineering we've documented, but perhaps never fully comprehended, silent, waiting, marking coordinates that matter for reasons we inherit as questions rather than answers. Still there, after all this time, still exactly where they were built, still doing whatever it is they do.